Some men carry wounds that never show on their skin, invisible scars etched not by bullets or shrapnel, but by betrayal. The American flag outside the small watchmaker's shop snaps in the Montana wind, its edges frayed from years of faithful service. Like the man who raises it each dawn with military precision, it bears the quiet dignity of something that has endured. For 15 years, that flag has kept its secrets. 15 years of silence, of looking over shoulders, of nightmares that taste like desert dust and gunpowder. 15 years of wondering when the past might come to collect its due. In the distance, the rumble of motorcycles breaks the morning stillness. Not just any engines, these carry the distinct rhythm of hunters who finally found their prey. Some flags are raised as symbols of freedom, others mark the graves of fallen brothers, and some, the rarest kind, stand as silent witnesses to truths that powerful men have killed to keep buried. The sun hadn't yet crested the Montana mountains when Thomas Garrett unlocked the front door of Garrett's timepieces. 70 years had weathered his face like the leather of an old baseball glove, but his movements remained precise, deliberate. The ritual never changed. First, he turned on the lights, then started the coffee maker in the back room. Lastly, most importantly, he reached for the folded American flag in the display case behind the counter. Thomas carried it outside with both hands like a communion offering. He secured it to the pole mount that had hung outside his shop for 15 years. The flag rippled as a cold mountain breeze caught it. This wasn't just any flag. It had flown over their forward operating base in Fallujah. It had been draped over the caskets of 8 men who had trusted him with their lives. The small digital bell chimed as Thomas re-entered the shop. He glanced at his watch, 5:47 a.m. Right on schedule. He walked past the rows of antique clocks and watches their ticking a comforting chorus. From beneath the counter, he retrieved a small wooden box containing his tools and a pocket watch with a blank brass backing. The date spoke to him from the wall calendar, April 15th. The anniversary. With steadiness that defied his age, Thomas began engraving a name onto the watchback, just as he had done every year on this date. 8 watches hung in a glass display case, never for sale, each bearing a single name and date. Today's would be the 9th. "I didn't forget, James," he whispered. The shop's front door jingled. Sarah Newman stood in the doorway, her sheriff's uniform pressed her badge catching the morning light. At 32, she was the youngest person ever to hold the position of sheriff in Riverdale. Her father had been military too, a Marine who never came home from Afghanistan. "Morning, mister." "Garrity," she said, reaching for the coffee Thomas had already poured for her. "Working early again." Thomas tucked the pocket watch into his drawer. "Sleep's overrated at my age, Sheriff." Sarah's eyes lingered on the flag outside. "It's that day again, isn't it?" Thomas didn't answer. They had this conversation every April 15th. "Town council meeting was interesting last night," she said, changing the subject. "There's been talk of a motorcycle gang causing trouble 2 counties over, calling themselves the Vipers. Intel says they might be heading this way." Thomas's hands paused for just a moment before continuing to polish the glass counter. "Riverdale's too small to interest anyone like that." "Maybe." Sarah sipped her coffee. "But their leader guy named Vance Delaney apparently has a talent for finding vulnerable towns. Ex-military dishonorable discharge. Been on my radar for a while." Thomas's shoulders tensed slightly at the name. "You okay, mister?" "Garrett, fine," he said. "Just old bones complaining about the weather." Sarah's radio crackled. A fender bender on Main Street needed her attention. She drained her coffee. "Almost forgot Emma stopped by the station yesterday. Wanted to know if I could talk you into speaking at her school's Veterans Day program." Thomas shook his head. "She knows better than to ask. She's persistent. Says she barely knows anything about your service. Navy SEAL, right? Must have some stories worth telling." "Some stories shouldn't be told, Sheriff." His voice was gentle but final. Sarah nodded, understanding boundaries. "Take care, Mr. Garrett. I'll check in tomorrow." After she left, Thomas retrieved the pocket watch from the drawer. His fingers traced the outline of the name he'd been engraving, James Lawson. The memories came uninvited. The dust-choked streets of Fallujah, the radio crackling with desperate coordinates, the ambush, the bodies, and always, Vance Delaney walking away, disappearing into the smoke. Thomas closed his eyes, breathing deeply until the images receded. When he opened them, he noticed he'd gripped the edge of the counter so hard his knuckles had gone white. Vance Delaney, after all these years. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe the past would stay buried for once. But Thomas Garrett hadn't survived 3 wars by believing in coincidences. Emma Garrett tapped her pencil against her notebook, her attention far from Ms. Wilson's lecture on World War II. At 16, her mind occupied itself with more pressing matters, like how to convince her grandfather to speak at next month's Veterans Day Assembly. Emma! Ms. Wilson's voice snapped her back to the classroom. Since you're clearly riveted by the Battle of the Bulge, perhaps you'd care to share your thoughts. Sorry, Ms. Wilson, Emma mumbled, feeling her cheeks flush. The bell rang, saving her from further embarrassment. As she gathered her books, her best friend Lily nudged her. Still obsessing over getting your grandpa to talk at the assembly? Emma sighed. Is it that obvious? Only to everyone with eyes, Lily laughed. But he's like a war hero, right? That's what my dad says. That's the thing, I don't know what he is. Emma shouldered her backpack. He never talks about it. Ever. Outside the school, Thomas waited in his faded blue 1993 Ford F-150. He didn't own a cell phone, claimed they gave people brain cancer, so he was always exactly on time, never early or late. Hey, Gramps, Emma said, climbing into the passenger seat. Good day at school. He asked the same question every day. Academic adventure, as always, she said. Then after a pause, so Lily's dad said you're a war hero. Thomas kept his eyes on the road. Hank talks too much. Man couldn't keep a secret if it came with a padlock. But it's true, right, Navy SEAL? That's what Miss Wilson says. She says you have a medal. Emma, he said firmly, let it go. But why everyone else's family talks about this stuff? Dad would have wanted me to know. Thomas's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Your father never saw combat. He was an accountant who served his 4 years in peacetime. Different experience. But you, drop it, Emma. His tone left no room for argument. Some things are better left alone. They drove in silence for several minutes before Emma spoke again. The Veterans Day Assembly is... No. You didn't even let me finish. Didn't need to. Thomas's expression softened slightly. Why don't you ask Sheriff Newman? Her father was a decorated Marine. Because she's not my grandfather, Emma said quietly. Thomas pulled the truck into the driveway of their modest 2-story house. Before Emma could open her door, he placed a weathered hand on her arm. Emma, listen. Some men come back from war just fine. They tell their stories, wear their uniforms in parades. Good for them. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Others bring back things they can't put down, things they don't want to hand off to the people they love. Emma studied her grandfather's face. For a moment she saw something there, a shadow, a weight that made him seem suddenly fragile. I'm sorry, Gramps, she said. The shadow passed and Thomas Garrett was once again the sturdy, stoic man she'd always known. Nothing to be sorry about. Now go start your homework while I fix dinner. Those calculus problems won't solve themselves. As Emma headed inside, Thomas remained in the truck, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The reflection showed only an empty street, but for a moment he could have sworn he saw the dust clouds of Fallujah, heard the popping of distant gunfire. Vance Delaney couldn't be coming here. Not to Riverdale. Not after all this time. But if he was, Thomas would be ready. The abandoned lumber mill on the outskirts of Riverdale had been silent for nearly a decade. Now the roar of motorcycles shattered that quiet as a convoy of bikes pulled into the weed-choked parking lot. 20 men dismounted, stretching road-cramped muscles. Their leather cuts displayed a striking emblem, a coiled viper fangs bared, wrapped around a combat knife. Vance Delaney surveyed the derelict building with cold appraisal. At 55, he was lean and hard, his face a roadmap of scars and lines. His salt and pepper hair was cropped military short, and a tattoo of his unit insignia peeked from beneath his sleeve, a reminder of the life that had been taken from him. This is it. Ryan Lawson stepped beside him, disappointment evident in his voice. At 35, Ryan was Vance's right hand, his most loyal lieutenant. We came all this way for this shithole town. Vance's lips curved in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. This shithole has something I've been looking for a long time. Must be valuable. Ryan scanned the surroundings, his posture betraying his military background. More than you know. Vance turned to address the gathered men. Settle in. Clear the main floor for operations. We'll be here a while. As the men moved to secure the building, Ryan lingered. What's really going on, Vance? We passed 3 bigger towns with better prospects. Vance pulled a worn photograph from his pocket and handed it to Ryan. It showed a younger Vance alongside other soldiers, arms around each other's shoulders, desert camouflage caked with dust. Second from left, Vance said. That's Thomas Garrett, Navy SEAL highly decorated. Lives right here in this nowhere town. Ryan studied the photo. Old friend. Old debt. Vance corrected, his voice hardening. One that's long overdue. What kind of debt? Vance took back the photograph, his fingers lingering on the faces. The kind paid in blood. He paused, eyes scanning the town in the distance. This town thinks it has a hero. What it has is a traitor who's been hiding from the truth for too long. Ryan knew better than to press further. He'd been with Vance for 8 years, ever since the older man had found him drunk and desperate outside a VA hospital in Colorado. Vance had pulled him from the gutter, given him purpose again. For that, Ryan owed him everything. What's the play? Ryan asked. We do what we always do. Take control, establish presence. But Garrett, Vance's voice dropped to a near whisper. Garrett's mine. No one touches him but me. Ryan nodded, trying to ignore the chill that Vance's tone sent through him. He'd seen that look before the last time 3 men had ended up in shallow graves outside Tulsa. As they walked toward the mill, Ryan glanced over his shoulder at Riverdale, a cluster of lights coming alive in the dusk. Whatever was waiting there, whatever history Vance had with this Thomas Garrett, Ryan knew one thing for certain. This small Montana town had no idea what was coming for it. The first signs of trouble appeared 3 days later. The Vipers rolled into town in groups of 4 or 5 leather cuts, gleaming bikes thundering down Main Street. They were methodical, targeting businesses one by one. Not for money, not yet, but for something possibly more valuable: fear. Bill's Hardware received their visit first, then Martha's Diner, the gas station, the grocery store. Each time the message was the same: protection is coming. You'll want it when it does. Thomas watched from his shop window as 4 bikes parked outside. The lead rider, not Vance, but a bull-necked man with a shaved head, swaggered toward Garrett's timepieces. The bell chimed as the door opened. 3 men entered, filling the small shop with the smell of leather and exhaust. The 4th remained outside, eyeing the American flag with unconcealed contempt. Can I help you, gentlemen? Thomas asked, his voice level, despite the hammering in his chest. Nice place, said the leader, picking up a pocket watch and examining it carelessly. Valuable merchandise. Be a shame if something happened to it. Thomas gently took the watch from the man's hand and returned it to its display. Nothing here worth stealing, I'm afraid. Just old clocks for old people. The biker chuckled. Not here to steal, old-timer. Here to offer a service. Not interested. The man's smile disappeared. Didn't say what the service was. Achy, don't need to, Thomas replied. Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying. The bell chimed again as the 4th biker entered, a sneer twisting his lips. Flag outside is looking threadbare, pops. Should probably replace it with something worth a damn. Thomas's eyes hardened. That flag is worth more than you'll ever understand. The atmosphere shifted instantly, tension thickening. The leader stepped forward, now inches from Thomas's face. You think you're tough, old man? Think you've seen things? Thomas didn't flinch. I think you should leave. Now. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, unexpectedly, the leader laughed. You got spirit, I'll give you that. He backed away, nodding to his companions. We'll be back. Town's changing. You'll want friends when it does. As they turned to leave, the 4th biker deliberately knocked over a display of watches. Glass shattered across the floor. Oops, he said with a smirk. Butterfingers. The door closed behind them, the bell's cheerful chime now somehow ominous. Thomas didn't move immediately. He scanned the street through the window, watching until the bikes disappeared around the corner. Only then did he reach for the broom and dustpan. As he swept up the broken glass, his hand trembled slightly, not from fear but from the effort of restraint. There had been a moment when the biker was inches from his face that decades of training had nearly taken over. Old instincts bubbling just beneath the surface. The bell chimed again. Thomas looked up, tension returning, but it was only Sarah Newman. I just saw who was in here, she said, hand resting instinctively on her holstered sidearm. You okay? Fine, Thomas replied, continuing to sweep. Just a broken display. Sarah surveyed the damage. This is how it starts. Intimidation, small damage. Then it escalates. I've seen it before. You've dealt with gangs like this. Not personally, but I've studied them. She helped gather larger glass shards. The Vipers have a pattern. They move into small towns, establish protection rackets, basically take over. Law enforcement gets overwhelmed or bought off. Not you, Thomas observed. Sarah smiled grimly. No, not me. But I'm one person with 2 deputies, and the Vipers travel with at least 20 men. Thomas dumped the glass into the trash. You've called for backup. State police say they'll send someone to assess the situation. Translation, we're on our own for now. She paused. These aren't just criminals, Mr. Garrett. Their leader, Delaney, he's ex-military. Dishonorable discharge. Rumor has it he was special forces before something went wrong. Thomas's expression revealed nothing. Lots of men wash out of special forces. This was different. Something bad in Iraq about 15 years ago. Records are sealed. She studied him closely. You were there, weren't you, Iraq? Long time ago, Thomas said flatly. Maybe that's why they targeted your shop first, Sarah suggested. Delaney might have an issue with veterans. Thomas put away the broom. Maybe, or maybe it's just a coincidence. Sarah clearly didn't believe it, but she let it go. I'll increase patrols near your place. Keep your doors locked at night. After she left, Thomas walked to the window, watching the quiet street. His reflection stared back at him, an old man, shoulders still square. Despite the years, eyes still sharp, despite what they'd seen. He'd known this day might come, had prepared for it in his way. Thomas reached beneath the counter and pressed a hidden button. A small panel slid open, revealing a secure safe. The combination came automatically Emma's birthday. Inside was a satellite phone, one that had not been used in a decade. Next to it lay a single dog tag on a chain and a photograph similar to the one Vance carried. Thomas took out the photo. 8 men and himself, arms around shoulders, exhausted but alive. On the back, 8 names were written in fading ink. He knew them by heart, just as he knew the watches that bore those names in the shop's special display. Below the names was a 9th Vance Delaney. Thomas returned the photo to the safe but pocketed the satellite phone. Not yet, but soon perhaps. Vance was here. After 15 years, he'd found him. Thomas Garrett had run out of time. Emma could feel the change in the town within days. Her friends' parents no longer let them hang out after dark. The normally busy Main Street cleared out by 7. Sheriff Newman's cruiser seemed to be everywhere at once. But the biggest change was in her grandfather. Thomas had always been quiet, but now he was watchful. He insisted on driving Emma to and from school, despite her protests that she was old enough to walk. He checked the locks twice before bed, and he spent long hours in the basement doing something he wouldn't talk about. It's those bikers, isn't it? Emma asked one evening as they washed dishes after dinner. Everyone at school is talking about them. Thomas handed her a plate to dry. Just passing through, I expect. That's not what Sheriff Newman thinks. Lily heard her mom talking to the mayor. She says they're setting up at the old mill. Thomas's hands stilled in the soapy water. You stay away from there. Understand, nowhere near the mill. I'm not stupid, Gramps. Never said you were. But you're curious. Too curious sometimes. Emma rolled her eyes. Like you weren't at my age. A small smile touched Thomas's lips. At your age, I was jumping out of helicopters with 100 pounds of gear. Emma nearly dropped the plate. Her grandfather never volunteered information about his military service. You were 16 when you joined up. The smile vanished. 17. Lied about my age. He returned to scrubbing a pot with unnecessary force. Different time. Dad never told me that. Your father and I didn't talk much about those days. Emma placed the dried plate in the cabinet, choosing her next words carefully. Gramps, I found something in the attic. Thomas tensed. What were you doing in the attic? Looking for Mom's old yearbooks, but I found this. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline read, Local Man Awarded Navy Cross for Heroism in Iraq. Thomas took the clipping, his face unreadable. Where did you get this? I told you the attic, in a box with Dad's college stuff. Emma watched him closely. It says you saved 8 men, that you went back into an ambush zone after being wounded. Thomas folded the clipping and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Newspapers exaggerate. So you didn't save anyone. Emma, enough. His voice wasn't angry, just tired. Some things are private, even from family, especially from family. But Dad would have wanted, your father wanted you safe and happy, Thomas interrupted. That's all he ever wanted. That's all I want. The finality in his tone ended the conversation, but Emma wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Her grandfather was hiding something. Something connected to those bikers, she was sure of it. And Emma Garrett had inherited her grandfather's stubborn streak. The following morning, the Vipers escalated their campaign. Mike Wilson's gas station was the first to bend. Then Ben's grocery. By noon, 5 businesses had agreed to pay weekly protection in exchange for being left alone. Those who refused found their windows broken, tires slashed, or worse. Sheriff Newman was everywhere documenting incidents, taking statements, but her hands were tied. Without witnesses willing to come forward, there was little she could do. This can't go on, she told Thomas, stopping by his shop that afternoon. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. They're systematically taking over. State police, Thomas asked, said they can't commit resources based on property damage and hearsay? Sarah's frustration was palpable. Not until there's violence against persons. By then it might be too late. Tell me about it. She massaged her temples. Town council's called an emergency meeting tonight. You should come. Thomas shook his head. Not my style. These people respect you, Mr. Garrett. Your voice carries weight. I fix watches, Sheriff. That's all. Sarah studied him for a long moment. You know, for someone who doesn't want to get involved, you seem awfully prepared. She nodded toward the new deadbolt on his door, the reinforced window frames. Almost like you've been expecting trouble. Thomas met her gaze steadily. Man my age learns to be careful. I man your age with your background knows more than he's saying, Sarah countered. She leaned forward. Level with me. Do you know something about Delaney? Is that why they're here? Before Thomas could answer, the shop's bell chimed. Both turned to see Ryan Lawson enter, his leather cut marking him instantly as one of the Vipers. Unlike the others who'd visited, his demeanor was controlled, almost professional. Sheriff, he nodded to Sarah, then turned to Thomas. Mr. Garrett, I presume. Shop's closed, Thomas said flatly. Ryan ignored him, moving to examine the display of memorial watches. Beautiful craftsmanship, military precision. His fingers hovered over the glass but didn't touch. Vance Delaney sends his regards. Thomas's face remained impassive, but Sarah noticed his hands curling into fists at his sides. Tell him I'm not interested in his regards, Thomas replied. Ryan smiled thinly. He thought you might say that. He also thought you might want this back. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a weathered dog tag on a chain. Thomas stared at it, recognition and shock flashing briefly across his face, before his expression hardened again. James Lawson, Ryan said, reading the name on the tag. My brother. You knew him, didn't you? Mr. Garrett. Sarah looked between them, confusion evident. What's going on here? Ryan kept his eyes on Thomas. Vance wants to meet. Tonight. At the mill. Just you and him for old time's sake. If you're here to intimidate Mr. Garrett, Sarah began, I'm here to deliver a message. Ryan cut her off. Vance says you have a choice, Garrett. Come alone tonight or he starts visiting that pretty granddaughter of yours. Sarah's hand moved to her holstered weapon. That's a direct threat. You're under arrest. Ryan laughed. For delivering a message, good luck making that stick, Sheriff. He placed the dog tag on the counter. 8 o'clock, Garrett. Don't be late. He turned and walked out, the bell chiming cheerfully behind him. Sarah immediately pulled out her radio. I'm calling this in. That was a clear threat against Emma. Thomas placed his hand over hers, stopping her. Don't. Are you kidding me? He just threatened your granddaughter. And calling it in will only make things worse. Thomas's voice was steady. Trust me on this. Sarah reluctantly lowered the radio. Then talk to me. What was that about? How does Delaney know you and whose dog tag is that? Thomas picked up the tag, his thumb brushing over the embossed name. James Lawson. He was under my command in Iraq. He died during an ambush in Fallujah 2007. And that man Ryan is his brother. Thomas nodded. Looks like it. Must have been young when James died. And Delaney? How does he fit in? Thomas hesitated, years of silence, warring with immediate necessity. Finally he said, he was our officer, Lieutenant Vance Delaney. Sarah's eyes widened. So this is personal? He's here because of you. Seems that way. What happened in Fallujah, Mr. Garrett? Thomas returned the dog tag to the counter. That's between Delaney and me. Not anymore, Sarah insisted. Not when he's threatening your granddaughter. Not when my town is being terrorized. When Thomas remained silent, she added, I can help you, but not if you keep me in the dark. Thomas considered her words. In 15 years, he'd told no one the full story of what happened that day in Fallujah. Not the military investigators. Not his wife before she passed. Not his son. The truth was his burden alone. But now Emma was in danger. Tonight, he finally said, after the town meeting. But not here. He wrote down his address and handed it to her. 9 o'clock, and come alone. Sarah took the paper, concern etched on her face. You're not actually considering meeting Delaney by yourself, are you? Just be there at 9. Thomas said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. After Sarah left, Thomas picked up the dog tag again. James Lawson had been the youngest on their team, just 22. Smart, funny, with a photograph of his little brother he'd shown proudly to anyone who would look. That little brother was now Ryan Lawson, Vance Delaney's right-hand man. Thomas slipped the dog tag into his pocket and walked to the back room. From a cabinet, he retrieved a small metal box, unlocking it with a key he kept around his neck. Inside was a Desert Eagle .50 caliber pistol, meticulously maintained despite years without use. Thomas checked the magazine, then the action. The weapon felt both foreign and familiar in his hands, like greeting an old friend you'd hope never to see again. He had no intention of using it. But Vance Delaney was not a man who responded to reason. Never had been. As Thomas relocked the shop, his gaze fell on the American flag outside, now stirring in the afternoon breeze. 8 men who never came home. 8 watches in his display case. And now it seemed a 9th soul demanding justice or vengeance. The town meeting was a disaster. Mayor Wilson, a small man with an even smaller spine, proposed opening a dialogue with the Vipers. Half the business owners, those who'd already caved to protection payments, supported him. The other half argued for standing firm. Sheriff Newman presented the facts: 23 incidents of intimidation or property damage in 4 days. No cooperation from state police. No witnesses willing to testify. We're on our own, she concluded, but that doesn't mean we surrender. From the back of the room, Thomas watched silently. He'd chosen a seat near the exit where he could observe everything. Emma sat beside him, having insisted on coming despite his objections. This is ridiculous, she whispered as the mayor stuttered through another plea for reasonable accommodation. They're talking about giving the town away. Fear makes people reasonable, Thomas replied quietly. Makes them forget who they are. The meeting deteriorated into shouting. Mrs. Henderson from the bakery was in tears, describing how they'd threatened her teenage son. Bill from the hardware store argued for forming a citizens' patrol. The mayor mopped his brow and called repeatedly for order. Nobody noticed the door open. Nobody except Thomas. Vance Delaney entered alone, his presence immediately commanding attention as conversations died away. He wore no leather cut, just jeans and a button-down shirt, but his bearing marked him as clearly as any uniform. Evening, folks, he said, his voice carrying effortlessly. Hope I'm not interrupting. Sheriff Newman was on her feet instantly, hand on her holstered weapon. This is a closed town meeting. Vance smiled, a gesture that never reached his eyes. And I'm just a concerned citizen interested in the welfare of this fine community. You're trespassing, Sarah said firmly. Actually, Mayor Wilson interjected nervously, perhaps we should hear what Mr. Delaney has to say. Sarah shot the mayor a look of disbelief, but he avoided her gaze. Vance stepped forward, commanding the room without raising his voice. I understand there's been some concern about my associates and me. Understandable given how quickly we arrived. He spread his hands. But we're businessmen, plain and simple. We provide services, protection, conflict resolution, business support. Extortion and intimidation, you mean? Sarah countered. Vance's smile tightened. Strong words, Sheriff. I prefer to think of it as community investment. He addressed the room at large. Times are tough. Small towns like Riverdale get overlooked. Law enforcement is stretched thin. We fill that gap. Thomas felt Emma tense beside him. Following her gaze, he realized Vance was looking directly at them. But I didn't come here to make a sales pitch, Vance continued. I came to address certain misconceptions, particularly those held by respected members of your community. He began walking toward Thomas, and the crowd parted unconsciously to let him through. Thomas Garrett, Vance said, stopping a few feet away. Navy SEAL, decorated war hero, pillar of the community. Each word dripped with contempt. Did you ever tell them the truth about Fallujah, Thomas? About what really happened to those men under your command? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Thomas remained seated, his expression unreadable. Mr. Delaney, Mayor Wilson stammered. This isn't the appropriate. It's exactly appropriate, Vance snapped. This town harbors a man it thinks is a hero. They deserve to know what he really is. Emma gripped her grandfather's arm. Gramps, what's he talking about? Vance smiled coldly. Yes, Gramps, tell her. Tell her how you abandoned your men in an ambush. How you ran while they died. Thomas finally stood his movement, deliberate. I think you should leave, Vance. Or what, you'll run away again? Vance's voice rose. 8 men died because of you. 8 men who trusted you. That's not what happened, Thomas said quietly. You know it isn't. I know what I saw, Vance shouted. I was there. I watched you desert your post. Thomas remained calm. We both know why you're really here, Vance, and it has nothing to do with the truth. Sheriff Newman positioned herself between them. That's enough. Mr. Delaney, you need to leave. Now. For a moment, the tension was palpable. Then Vance stepped back, his composure returning like a mask sliding into place. Of course, Sheriff. I've said what I came to say. He turned to address the crowd. Ask yourselves who you want protecting this town. A corrupt sheriff who can't maintain order. A coward who abandoned his men. He paused for effect. Or people who actually get results. With that, he walked out, leaving stunned silence in his wake. Immediately, everyone began talking at once. Some demanded explanations from Thomas. Others argued for accepting the Viper's protection. Through it all, Emma stared at her grandfather, hurt and confusion evident in her eyes. Is it true, she whispered. What he said about you? Thomas met her gaze steadily. No. Then what? Not here. He cut her off. We'll talk at home. But as they left the community center, Thomas knew the damage was done. Vance had achieved exactly what he wanted, to isolate him, to plant seeds of doubt. The old battle lines were being redrawn, and Thomas was running out of options. They drove home in silence, the weight of unspoken questions filling the cab of the old Ford. Thomas had expected anger from Emma, demands for the truth. Instead, she stared out the passenger window, occasionally wiping away tears she thought he couldn't see. That was worse than anger. That was disappointment. As they pulled into the driveway, Thomas turned off the engine but made no move to get out. Emma, he began. What happened in Fallujah? It's complicated. And you said it wasn't true, she replied, still looking out the window. That's all I need to know. It's not that simple. Emma finally turned to face him. Then make it simple. For once in your life, just tell me the truth. I defend you at school. I tell everyone how brave my grandfather is. And then this man shows up and says, you. Her voice broke. Thomas reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Go inside, he said gently. I need to make a call. Then we'll talk. I promise. Emma searched his face, perhaps looking for signs of another deflection. Finally, she nodded and got out of the truck. Thomas waited until she was inside before retrieving the satellite phone from his jacket pocket. The battery still held a charge. He'd maintained it meticulously over the years, hoping never to use it. He dialed from memory. 1 ring, 2, 3. This number is no longer in service, an automated voice announced. Thomas felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He tried again with the same result. His contingency plan, the only one he'd ever made, was gone. As he sat there, headlights swept across the driveway. Sheriff Newman's cruiser pulled up, and she got out, her expression grim. You're early, Thomas noted as she approached. Meeting ended right after you left, Sarah replied. Everyone talking about Delaney's accusations. Thought I'd better check on you and Emma. Thomas pocketed the phone. She's inside, confused, hurt. Can't blame her. Sarah leaned against the truck. I'm pretty confused myself. I said we'd talk at 9. It's 8:45, Sarah pointed out. And given what just happened, I think we should move up the timeline. Thomas checked his watch, realizing with a start that she was right. His meeting with Vance at the mill was in 15 minutes. Come inside, he said, making a decision. I need you to stay with Emma while I go out. Sarah's eyes narrowed. You're meeting him, aren't you? After he publicly accused you of getting men killed, after he threatened your granddaughter. That's why I'm going. It's a trap, Mr. Garrett. He wants to isolate you, provoke you. I know exactly what he wants, Thomas replied, his voice hardening. And I'm not going to give it to him. But I am going to end this. Sarah stood her ground. Not without backup, you're not. That's not a request, it's an order. You don't give me orders, Sheriff. No, but I can arrest you for obstruction if you're interfering with an investigation. Thomas almost smiled. You'd have to catch me first. Mr. Garrett Thomas, please. Sarah's voice softened. Whatever happened between you and Delaney, whatever this is about, let me help. That's my job. Thomas considered her words. She was young, idealistic, but he'd seen her stand up to Vance when others backed down. She had courage. All right, he finally said. But we do this my way. Sarah nodded. I'm listening. Thomas outlined his plan quickly. It wasn't much of one meet Vance, hear him out try to contain the situation before it escalated further. Sarah would position herself outside the mill as backup, intervening only if absolutely necessary. That's not a plan, that's a suicide mission, Sarah protested. Vance won't kill me, Thomas said with certainty. Not yet. Not until he gets what he really wants. Which is, Thomas checked his watch again. We don't have time. Just follow my lead, and whatever happens, keep Emma safe. They went inside to find Emma waiting in the living room, arms crossed defensively. Emma, Sheriff Newman's going to stay with you for a while, Thomas said, already heading for the basement door. Where are you going? Emma demanded. To fix this. How? By running away, like he said. Thomas paused the accusation, striking deeper than he expected. No, he said softly. By facing it, finally. In the basement, Thomas quickly retrieved what he needed, the Desert Eagle, a tactical flashlight, and a small first aid kit that he tucked into a worn leather jacket. When he came back upstairs, Sarah was explaining the situation to Emma, whose anger had given way to fear. Gramps, don't go, she pleaded. If what he said isn't true, then why does he hate you so much? Why is he doing this? Thomas crossed to her and placed his hands on her shoulders. Because 15 years ago, I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. Something Vance Delaney did, and he's been running from it ever since. Then tell the police, tell the army, tell someone. It's not that simple, Emma. There was no proof, just my word against his. Thomas took a deep breath. After tonight, you'll know everything, I promise. Emma hugged him suddenly, fiercely. Be careful, please. Thomas held her tight, memorizing the moment. Then he nodded to Sarah and headed for the door. 1 hour, he told her. If I'm not back, call this number. He handed her a piece of paper. Tell them Operation Ghost Rider. They'll understand. Sarah took the paper questions in her eyes, but Thomas was already gone, disappearing into the night toward whatever reckoning awaited him at the abandoned mill. The clock was ticking. Cotorito. The old lumber mill loomed against the night sky, a hulking shadow pierced by the occasional glow of cigarettes and flashlights. Thomas approached on foot, having parked his truck half a mile away. Years had passed since he'd moved this way, silent, alert, scanning for threats, but the training remained embedded in muscle memory. He noted 4 sentries positioned around the perimeter, all armed. Motorcycles lined the east side of the building. A generator hummed somewhere, providing power. Thomas circled to the loading dock on the north side, avoiding the guards. A door stood ajar, light spilling from within. An invitation. He checked his watch, 8:03 p.m. Vance had always appreciated punctuality. Thomas palmed the Desert Eagle, but kept it concealed in his jacket pocket as he slipped through the door. Inside the mill was a cavernous space filled with the ghosts of machinery long removed. The floor had been cleared, and in the center stood a table with 2 chairs illuminated by portable floodlights. Vance Delaney sat in one chair, a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses before him. No visible weapon, but Thomas knew better than to assume he was unarmed. "Right on time," Vance called out. "Some things never change." Thomas approached cautiously, scanning the upper catwalks and shadows. He counted at least 6 men positioned strategically around the space. Ryan Lawson stood at Vance's right shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Just us, Garrett," Vance said, noticing his vigilance. "A private reunion." Thomas stopped a few feet from the table, making no move to sit. "Say what you came to say, Vance." Vance poured whiskey into both glasses and pushed one toward the empty chair. 15 years, and that's your greeting. No, how have you been? Or, you're looking well. You threatened my granddaughter. A motivational tactic. Nothing personal. Vance gestured to the chair. "Sit. Drink. We have much to discuss." Recognizing that refusing would only escalate tensions, Thomas sat, though he left the whiskey untouched. "I've thought about this moment for a long time," Vance said, studying Thomas like a curiosity. "The great Thomas Garrett, the ghost of Fallujah. The man who single-handedly rescued 6 men from an ambush." He took a drink. "Quite the reputation you built on lies." "I never wanted any reputation," Thomas replied. "I disappeared, changed my name back to my mother's maiden name, moved to the middle of nowhere. How did you find me?" Vance smiled thinly. "You think you're the only one with connections? It took time, but eventually someone remembered a Thomas Garrett who'd moved to Montana after his discharge. From there, it was just a matter of patience. Why now after all this time? Because now I'm ready." Vance's smile vanished. "Ready to expose you for what you really are. Ready to take back what you stole from me." Thomas leaned forward. "I didn't steal anything, Vance. You lost it all on your own." "Liar!" Vance slammed his fist on the table, whiskey sloshing from his glass. "You betrayed me. You ruined everything." Ryan stepped forward, placing a calming hand on Vance's shoulder. Vance took a deep breath, his composure returning like a mask sliding back into place. "Sorry about that," Vance said with forced pleasantness. "Old wounds, you understand." He refilled his glass. "Did you ever tell anyone what happened that day?" "The real story." Thomas shook his head. "No one would have believed me. You made sure of that." "Ah, yes, my connections, as you put it." Vance smiled again. "Useful things, connections, especially when you're supplying certain people with certain commodities they can't easily acquire through official channels." "You mean the diamonds," Thomas said flatly. "The ones you got 8 men killed for." Ryan tensed visibly at this, his eyes darting between them. Vance laughed, still so self-righteous. "Those diamonds were going to make us rich, Thomas. All of us. A retirement plan for warriors who'd given everything to a country that would discard them like used tissues." "Those diamonds were funding the same insurgents who were killing our men," Thomas countered. "You sold us out. You gave them our coordinates, our patrol route. You led us right into that ambush." Ryan's face drained of color. "What is he talking about, Vance?" Vance waved dismissively. "Lies, Ryan. The desperate fabrications of a coward who abandoned his men and needs someone to blame." Thomas turned to Ryan. "Your brother James, he discovered what Vance was doing. That's why he died. Not because of me. Because he knew too much." "Don't listen to him," Vance warned, but doubt had already crept into Ryan's expression. "I have proof," Thomas continued. "James kept a journal. He gave it to me the night before the ambush, said he didn't trust anyone else. That's what Vance really wants. That's why he's here." Vance's hand moved toward his waistband. "Enough." The journal detailed everything: the diamond smuggling, the meetings with insurgent leaders, the kickbacks to certain officials who looked the other way. "Soccer." Thomas kept his eyes on Ryan. "Your brother was a hero, Ryan. He died trying to expose a traitor." Ryan turned to Vance, confusion and anger warring in his features. "Is this true? Did you have something to do with James's death?" "Of course not," Vance scoffed. "Garrett's desperate. He knows I'm about to expose him, so he's trying to turn you against me." "Then why are we really here?" Ryan demanded. "You said this was about making him pay for deserting the unit, but now he's talking about diamonds and ambushes and James finding something out." Vance's expression hardened. "Don't question me, Ryan. Not now. Not after everything I've done for you." Thomas saw his opening a crack in the foundation of trust between Vance and his lieutenant. "Ask yourself, Ryan," Thomas pressed. "Why would I run from an ambush when my record shows I'd run toward danger every other time? Why would I abandon men I'd fought alongside for years? What would I gain?" Ryan looked increasingly uncertain. "Vance!" Vance exploded from his chair, drawing a pistol and pointing it at Thomas. "I said enough!" The room froze. The other Vipers shifted nervously, hands moving to their own weapons. "You always were a poor liar, Vance," Thomas said calmly. "Even back then. That's why you needed the journal destroyed. Too many specifics, too many details that could be verified." "Where is it?" Vance demanded, the gun steady in his hand. "The journal. Where did you hide it?" "Somewhere safe," Thomas replied. "Somewhere you'll never find it." Vance's finger tightened on the trigger. "Tell me or I swear to God I'll—" "You'll what?" Thomas challenged. "Kill me in front of all these witnesses, including the brother of a man whose death you caused?" Ryan's hand had moved to his own weapon. Vance put the gun down. "This isn't what we discussed." "Stay out of this, Ryan," Vance snapped. "This is between me and him." "No," Ryan said firmly. "Not anymore." He turned to Thomas. "You said you have proof. Show me." Thomas stared down the barrel of Vance's gun. "Not here. Not with him holding a weapon on me." The standoff stretched seconds, feeling like hours. Finally, Vance lowered the gun slightly. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "Let's all go see this proof. Together." Thomas stood slowly. "It's at my shop, in a safe." Vance gestured with the gun. "After you, then. And Garrett," his voice dropped to a deadly whisper, "if you're lying, I'll put a bullet in you. Then I'll find that granddaughter of yours and—" The sound of a shotgun being racked cut through the air. "I wouldn't finish that sentence if I were you." Sheriff Newman's voice rang out from the shadows. Everyone turned to see Sarah emerging from behind a stack of pallets, shotgun aimed steadily at Vance. "Sheriff," Vance said quickly, lowering his gun. "This is a private meeting." "Not anymore," Sarah replied. "And threatening a minor is a felony in Montana. So's pointing a firearm at someone. You're under arrest, Mr. Delaney." Vance laughed. "Look around, Sheriff. You're outnumbered 6-1. 7-1. Thomas corrected his own Desert Eagle, now out, and pointed at Vance. "I never was good at math." For a moment, no one moved. Then Ryan Lawson made his decision. He stepped away from Vance, his hand moving from his weapon. "I want to see this proof," he announced. "I want to know what happened to my brother." Vance's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful piece of—" The crack of gunfire split the air. Thomas felt a searing pain across his arm as one of the Vipers, nervous and trigger-happy, fired prematurely. Chaos erupted. Sarah dropped to one knee, firing the shotgun into the ceiling. The thunderous blast momentarily stunned everyone, creating a critical second of confusion. Thomas seized the opportunity, diving forward and tackling Vance to the ground. The gun skittered across the floor as they grappled, years of hatred fueling their strength. Around them, the Vipers scattered for cover as Sarah shouted warnings. Ryan ducked behind the table, clearly unwilling to fire on either man. "It's over, Vance," Thomas grunted, pinning the younger man's arms. "Give it up." Vance's response was a savage headbutt that connected with Thomas's jaw, sending him sprawling backward. Vance scrambled for his gun, grabbing it and spinning toward Thomas. Time slowed. Thomas saw Vance's finger tightening on the trigger, saw Sarah raising her shotgun too late, saw his own Desert Eagle dropped in the struggle too far to reach. Then a single shot rang out. Vance jerked, a look of surprise crossing his face. A dark stain spread across his shoulder as he dropped to his knees, the gun falling from suddenly limp fingers. Behind him stood Ryan Lawson, his pistol still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. "For James," Ryan said quietly. "For the truth." Sheriff Newman moved quickly, securing Vance's weapon and handcuffing him, despite his groans of pain. Around them, the Vipers melted away, unwilling to risk a firefight against uncertain odds. "You all right?" Sarah asked Thomas, noticing the blood seeping through his jacket sleeve. "Just a graze," he assured her, already applying pressure to the wound. Ryan approached cautiously, holstering his weapon. "I want to see this journal. Tonight." Thomas nodded. "You will. You have my word." As Sarah radioed for backup in an ambulance, Thomas looked down at Vance Delaney, the man who had once been his commanding officer, now bleeding and handcuffed on the dirty mill floor. It wasn't supposed to end this way, Vance muttered more to himself than to Thomas. Had it all planned. Plans change, Thomas replied. You taught me that, Lieutenant. Sarah secured the scene as best she could, but most of the Vipers had fled into the night. Only Ryan remained keeping a watchful eye on Vance. Thank you for coming, Thomas told Sarah as she finished bandaging his arm with supplies from a first aid kit. Though I seem to recall ordering you to stay with Emma. Sarah smiled grimly. I don't take orders well, and your granddaughter is safe with Deputy Miller at your house. The town, quiet for now, but word will spread fast about what happened here. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. And the journal? Sarah's expression turned quizzical. You mean there really is one? I thought you might be bluffing. I never bluff, Thomas said, pulling himself to his feet. But we need to move quickly. Once the Vipers regroup, they'll come looking for payback. As they prepared to transport Vance to the hospital under guard, Thomas caught Ryan's eye across the room. The younger man's face was a storm of emotions, betrayal, grief, confusion. I'll tell you everything, Thomas promised him. About James. About what really happened. Ryan nodded once sharply. You'd better. I've spent 10 years believing a lie. I need to know the truth. Thomas understood completely. After 15 years of silence, it was finally time for the truth to emerge. But as they left the mill, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Vance might be in custody, but the Vipers were still out there. And the flag that had started it all, the flag that had flown over Fallujah, that had draped the caskets of 8 brave men, was still just ashes. The war was far from over. Thomas Garrett sat in Sheriff Newman's office holding a gauze pad to his wounded arm as EMTs attended to Vance Delaney in the adjacent room. Through the glass partition, he could see Ryan Lawson watching his former mentor with a mixture of disgust and confusion. The bullet went clean through, Sarah said, returning with a cup of coffee for Thomas. He'll live to stand trial. If it gets that far, Thomas replied. Vance has connections, powerful ones. In a backwater Montana county, I doubt it. Thomas sipped the bitter coffee. Don't underestimate him. Even wounded, even in custody, he's dangerous. Sarah sat across from him, her expression serious. Then help me understand what we're dealing with. What happened in Fallujah? What's this journal you mentioned? Thomas glanced toward the door, ensuring they wouldn't be overheard. James Lawson's journal. He was our communications specialist. Smart kid, noticed things others missed. He paused, weighing 15 years of silence against present necessity. In early 2007, he started tracking anomalies in our patrol schedules. Routes changed at the last-minute supply convoys redirected, always by Vance's orders. A-bomb, and that was suspicious. Not at first, but then James noticed a pattern. Every time our routes changed, insurgent activity spiked elsewhere, almost like someone was clearing paths. Sarah leaned forward. For diamond smuggling, Thomas nodded. Conflict diamonds, moving through Iraq from Africa, headed for black markets in Europe and Asia. Big business, especially during wartime when normal supply chains broke down. And Delaney was facilitating this. More than facilitating, he was orchestrating it, working with local insurgent leaders, using our unit as unwitting cover. Thomas's jaw tightened. We were just chess pieces to him. But James figured it out. He kept notes, dates, times, coordinates, built a case. Thomas's eyes clouded with memory. The night before the ambush, he came to me. Said he didn't trust the chain of command, feared Vance had people on the inside. He gave me his journal for safekeeping. And the next day, we walked into a trap. 8 men died, including James. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. I should have seen it coming. Should have done something. Sarah reached across the desk, her hand covering his. You couldn't have known. But I did know afterward. Thomas said, his voice hardening. I knew exactly what had happened. But by then, Vance had already established his narrative that I'd panicked, abandoned my post. His connections made sure the official investigation went his way. Henri, so you kept silent all these years. Why not fight back? Thomas's expression was bleak. I tried. Went to JAG, my commanding officer. No one would listen. The journal wasn't enough, could have been fabricated, they said. Meanwhile, Vance's allies started making threats. Not against me, but against my family. My wife was battling cancer. My son had just had Emma. Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. So you disappeared, changed your name, buried the truth. I thought it was the only way to protect them. Thomas set down his coffee cup. I was wrong. Their conversation was interrupted as Ryan Lawson entered, his face tight with suppressed emotion. The ambulance is taking Vance to County General, he reported. 2 of your deputies are escorting. Sarah nodded. Good. We'll question him formally once he's stabilized. Ryan turned to Thomas. You promised me answers. About James. Thomas stood wincing slightly as his wounded arm protested. Not here. At my shop. The journal's there. Sarah grabbed her keys. I'll drive. And Ryan, she fixed him with a stern look. You're still technically in custody. Don't make me regret not cuffing you. Ryan nodded grimly. I just want the truth. After that, you can do what you want with me. The drive to Garrett's timepieces was tense and silent. Riverdale's streets were deserted, news of the confrontation at the mill having spread quickly. Lights burned in windows as residents peeked out, anxiously wondering if the danger had passed. At the shop, Thomas unlocked the door immediately, noticing something wrong. The air felt different, disturbed. His hand moved to the Desert Eagle hidden beneath his jacket. Someone's been here, he whispered. Sarah drew her service weapon. Stay behind me. They entered cautiously. The shop appeared untouched at first glance, but Thomas moved directly to the counter and the hidden safe beneath. It was open, empty. Damn it, he muttered. They beat us to it. Ryan scanned the shop, professional instincts taking over. No forced entry. Someone knew what they were looking for. The rest of the Vipers, Sarah concluded. Vance must have given them instructions as a contingency. Thomas shook his head. No, this is too clean, too precise. This was professional. Could Vance have had someone else in town? Someone we don't know about? Possibly. Thomas closed the empty safe. But the journal isn't the only copy. Ryan's head snapped up. What do you mean? Your brother was thorough. He made a backup. Thomas gestured for them to follow him to the back room. I kept the original in the safe as a decoy. The real insurance is elsewhere. In the shop's workshop, Thomas moved to an old mechanical clock on the wall, a grandfather clock that hadn't worked in years. He opened the case, reached behind the pendulum, and removed a small metal container. Digital scan of every page, he explained, opening the container to reveal a USB drive. Plus my own statement recorded the day after the ambush. Ryan took the drive, his hand trembling slightly. All this time, you had proof of what happened to James? Proof, but no power to use it, Thomas clarified. Not without putting others at risk. Sarah watched the exchange with growing concern. We should get this to a secure location. If the Vipers are looking for it, the sound of motorcycles cut her off. Multiple engines growing closer. Thomas moved to the window, peering through the blinds. At least 10 bikes, coming this way. Sarah reached for her radio. I'll call for backup. Won't get here in time, Thomas said, already moving to the shop's front door to lock it. We need to go. Now. Ryan joined Thomas at the window. Those aren't Vipers, he said, his voice tight with tension. Those are Reapers. Nakshari. Reapers, Sarah asked. Mercenaries, Ryan explained. Ex-military contractors. Vance uses them for special jobs too dirty, even for the Vipers. Thomas's expression darkened. Vance's insurance policy. If he goes down, they clean up the mess. Including witnesses, Ryan added grimly. Sarah checked her ammunition. My cruiser's out front. We can make it if we move now. Thomas shook his head. They'll expect that. We need another way. His mind worked rapidly, evaluating options. The shop backed onto an alley that led to the main street. 2 blocks north was the sheriff's station. But with only Sarah's sidearm and his own Desert Eagle against 10 armed professionals, a direct confrontation would be suicide. The tunnels, he said suddenly. What tunnels? Sarah asked. Prohibition-era smuggling routes. Most of the older buildings on Main Street are connected. Thomas moved to a storage closet at the back of the workshop. This town was built by bootleggers before it became a lumber outpost. He pushed aside boxes and tool cabinets, revealing a trap door set into the floor. Leads to the basement of the old bank building, now the pharmacy. From there, we can access other buildings. Sarah looked skeptical. You knew about this and never reported it. Never seemed relevant, Thomas replied, lifting the trapdoor. Until now. The sound of motorcycles stopped outside the shop. Flashlight beams swept across the front windows. Time to go, Thomas urged, gesturing toward the opening. Sarah descended first, followed by Ryan. Thomas grabbed a small go bag from behind the counter, emergency supplies he'd kept ready for 15 years, hoping never to need them. As he lowered himself into the tunnel, the shop's front window shattered under a hail of gunfire. The tunnel was low and narrow, forcing them to move in a crouch. The air was stale, thick with decades of dust and neglect. Sarah's flashlight provided the only illumination, casting long shadows ahead of them. How far? She whispered as they moved. 200 yards to the pharmacy, Thomas replied. Then we have options. Ryan, bringing up the rear, periodically glanced back to ensure they weren't being followed. They'll figure out we're gone soon enough, he warned. And they might know about these tunnels too. Thomas nodded grimly. We need to get to Emma. They'll go after her to draw me out. Deputy Miller's with her, Sarah reminded him. One deputy against Reapers. Thomas quickened his pace. We need to move faster. They reached a junction where the tunnel split in 3 directions. Pharmacy is left, Thomas directed. Right goes toward the hardware store. Straight continues under Main Street. Which way? Sarah asked. Thomas considered their options. The Reapers would likely have the shop surrounded by now, possibly with men positioned at other buildings along Main Street. Straight, he decided, takes us beneath the post office. There's a municipal access point there, leads to the sewer system. We can emerge 3 blocks from my house. They continued forward, the tunnel narrowing further. At one point, Sarah had to squeeze through a partially collapsed section, dislodging dirt and decades-old timber that sent them into a coughing fit. These tunnels aren't exactly up to code, she muttered. Didn't think I'd be conducting tours, Thomas replied dryly. After what felt like an eternity but was likely only 15 minutes, they reached a rusted ladder leading upward to a metal hatch. Post office basement, Thomas confirmed. Should be clear this time of night. Sarah went first, pushing up against the hatch. It resisted initially, then gave way with a groan of protesting metal. She climbed up, pistol ready, scanning for threats before signaling the all clear. They emerged into a dusty storage room filled with mail crates and forgotten equipment. Thomas led them to a service door that opened onto an alley behind the post office. Sewer access is there. He pointed to a manhole cover halfway down the alley. Ryan looked dubious. You expect us to... Unless you prefer facing the Reapers... Thomas cut him off. The sound of motorcycles nearby hastened their decision. Sarah and Ryan helped Thomas lift the heavy cover, revealing a maintenance ladder descending into darkness. Once inside, Thomas guided them through a maze of drainage tunnels, moving with the confidence of someone who had memorized escape routes long ago. You really were preparing for this, Sarah observed as they sloshed through shallow water. All these years. Hoped I'd never need it, Thomas replied. But Navy SEALs don't believe in being unprepared. They emerged from a drainage outlet near the creek that ran behind Thomas's neighborhood. The night air felt fresh and clean after the tunnels, but they allowed themselves only a moment's respite. Thomas's house was dark when they approached, which immediately set off alarm bells. Deputy Miller's cruiser was in the driveway, but no lights were visible inside. Something's wrong, Thomas whispered, drawing the Desert Eagle. Sarah nodded, her own weapon ready. Circle around back. I'll take the front. I'm coming with you, Ryan told Thomas, pulling his pistol. They split up, moving silently through the shadows. Thomas and Ryan approached from the rear of the house, pausing at the back door to listen for movement inside. Nothing. Thomas tried the handle, unlocked. Another bad sign. They entered through the kitchen, moving in the practiced formation of men trained for close-quarters combat. The house was silent, eerily so. In the living room, they found Deputy Miller face down on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Sarah entered from the front, her face tight with concern. Is he... Thomas knelt, checking for a pulse. Alive but barely. Single gunshot wound up her chest? Emma? Sarah asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. Thomas was already moving toward the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. Emma, he called, abandoning stealth for speed. Her bedroom was empty, the covers thrown back, a lamp shattered on the floor. Signs of a struggle. Thomas stood in the doorway, a cold dread settling over him. This was his nightmare, the very scenario he'd fled across the country to prevent. "She's gone," he said as Sarah and Ryan joined him. His voice was flat and motionless, the voice of a man retreating behind military discipline to manage unbearable fear. Sarah immediately radioed for an ambulance for Deputy Miller and issued a bolo for Emma, though she knew it was likely futile. The Reapers wouldn't be using public roads or recognizable vehicles. "Vance," Ryan said, his face hardening. "This has him written all over it." Thomas nodded, already moving back downstairs. "He's using her to flush me out, to get the journal." "But he's in custody," Sarah protested, following him. "In the hospital under guard." "Won't matter," Ryan said grimly. "The Reapers operate independently once activated. They have protocols, contingencies." In the living room, Thomas knelt beside the wounded deputy, checking his condition again. "Miller needs immediate medical attention. We can't wait for an ambulance." As if in response to his words, Deputy Miller's eyes fluttered open. Garrett." He gasped, his voice barely audible. Thomas leaned closer. "What happened, son? Where's Emma?" "Men, professional, knew what they were doing." Miller grimaced in pain. "Said, tell you, old mill, midnight, bring journal, or she dies." Sarah was already on her phone calling in her other deputy for emergency transport. "We need to get Miller to the hospital and set up a rescue operation." "No time," Thomas said, standing. "It's 10:30 now. The mill's 20 minutes away. If we wait for backup for a proper operation, Emma could be dead." "You can't just walk in there," Sarah argued. "That's exactly what they want." "I know," Thomas checked his weapon, "but I'm going anyway." Ryan stepped forward. "I'm coming with you. I know how the Reapers operate, know their tactics." Thomas studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Why, you hardly know us." "Because they used my brother's memory to manipulate me," Ryan said, his voice hard with resolve. "And because they shot a cop and took a 16-year-old girl. Some lines shouldn't be crossed." Thomas accepted this with a nod. "Sheriff, stay with your deputy until help arrives. Then coordinate with state police. Tell them we need tactical response at the old mill." Sarah looked ready to argue, but recognized the futility. "Just be careful, both of you." As they prepared to leave, Thomas retrieved the USB drive containing James's journal. He'd fought so hard to protect this truth, to keep it buried where it couldn't harm his family. Now that same truth was his only bargaining chip for Emma's life. The cost of silence had finally come due. In the abandoned mill, Emma Garrett sat with her hands zip-tied to a metal chair, fear warring with anger in her eyes. She'd been grabbed from her bed by men in tactical gear who moved with military precision, not the bikers her grandfather had warned her about, but something worse, something colder. 4 men guarded her position strategically around the cavernous space. Unlike the Vipers with their leather cuts and bravado, these men were practically invisible dark clothing. Minimal equipment, faces obscured by balaclavas. Professional ghosts. One man stood apart from the others, monitoring communications equipment. He hadn't spoken directly to Emma, but had made a call when they'd arrived, his words chilling in their clinical detachment. "Package secured, awaiting delivery of primary objective." Emma had fought when they'd taken her, kicked, screamed, even landed a solid blow to one kidnapper's throat, but they'd subdued her with practiced efficiency. Now she conserved her energy, watching and listening. Her grandfather had taught her that once during a camping trip. If you're ever in trouble, he'd said, don't waste energy fighting when you can't win. Observe, listen, wait for your moment. Tuntuman. This was the first time she'd seen the tactical side of her grandfather, the hints of the man he must have been before he was just Gramps. It made her wonder what else she didn't know about Thomas Garrett. The leader of the group approached his movements controlled and economical. Only his eyes were visible through the balaclava, cold and assessing. Your grandfather, he said, his voice professionally neutral. Will he bring what we want? Emma lifted her chin defiantly. I don't know what you're talking about. The journal, Lawson's journal. I don't know anything about a journal. The man studied her for a moment. I believe you. That's his way, isn't it? Keeping secrets, even from family. Emma said nothing, but the barb struck home. Her grandfather's secrecy had always hurt, had always felt like a lack of trust. You know, the man continued, your grandfather isn't the hero everyone thinks he is. So I've heard, Emma replied coolly. Some guy named Delaney already tried that line. A slight narrowing of the eyes, the only reaction behind the mask. Vance Delaney is a businessman with goals. Your grandfather is an obstacle. If he's just an obstacle, why go to all this trouble? Why take me? The man moved away without answering. Emma allowed herself a small smile. Her grandfather might keep secrets, but these men were afraid of him. That told her something important. Whatever this journal contained, it was worth kidnapping and killing for. And her grandfather, quiet, reserved Thomas Garrett, who fixed watches and raised flags at dawn, was at the center of it all. Betrayal. Thomas and Ryan approached the mill on foot, leaving Thomas's truck concealed half a mile away. They moved silently through the woods, two men who'd learned their craft in the world's harshest classroom. 4 outside, Ryan whispered, scanning with a small monocular. Standard perimeter coverage. 2 at the main entrance, 1 at the loading dock, 1 roving. Thomas nodded. Same entry point as before. Too obvious. They'll expect it. Ryan pointed to the far side of the building. Service entrance on the west side. Blind spot in their perimeter. They circled wide, using the trees for cover. Ryan moved with the smooth competence of a trained operator, confirming Thomas's suspicion that he was more than just Vance's lieutenant. You were military, Thomas observed quietly as they paused behind a fallen log. Ryan nodded. Rangers. 2 tours in Afghanistan. How'd you end up with Vance? A shadow crossed Ryan's face. After James died, I was lost. Enlisted to honor him, then couldn't adjust to civilian life after discharge. He checked their surroundings before continuing. Found me outside the VA in Denver. Drunk, homeless. Said he'd served with my brother, offered me purpose. He used you, Thomas said, not unkindly. Used your brother's memory. Yeah, Ryan agreed, bitterness evident. 15 years believing James died a hero and that you were responsible. He looked directly at Thomas. What really happened to him? Thomas had carried this story alone for so long, the weight of it crushing. James confronted Vance the night before the ambush, told him he knew about the diamond smuggling, was going to report it. Thomas's face darkened with the memory. Vance played it cool, said James was mistaken. But the next day during the ambush, I saw Vance give a signal to the insurgent leader. Then he moved away, drawing our defensive fire in the wrong direction. Gannon, James. Caught in the initial blast. I tried to reach him, but Thomas stopped, the memory still raw after 15 years. He was already gone, died instantly. Ryan absorbed this, his face tight with controlled emotion. So Vance arranged the ambush to eliminate James, and it killed 7 others as collateral damage. And nearly me, Thomas added. But I was supposed to die too. Clean sweep. They reached the west side of the mill, the service entrance just visible in the moonlight. No guards visible, but Thomas knew better than to assume it was unobserved. Thermal imaging, he whispered, pointing to a small device mounted above the door. They'll see us coming. Ryan studied the setup. Professional equipment, definitely Reapers. Options. Ryan thought for a moment, then reached into his pocket and produced a small device. Signal jammer. Short range, but it'll buy us a few minutes of ghost time. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Standard equipment for a Viper. Let's just say I came prepared for contingencies. Ryan activated the device. We have 3 minutes, maybe 4, before they detect the interference. That was all Thomas needed to hear. They moved quickly to the service entrance, where Ryan produced lockpicks and made short work of the padlock. Inside, they found themselves in a narrow corridor lined with rusted machinery. The ambient noise of generators masked their entry, but Thomas knew that advantage wouldn't last. Emma's likely being held in the main floor area, he whispered. Central location, maximum visibility. Ryan nodded. Reapers work in teams of 6. We've identified 4 outside, so at least 2 inside with her. Probably more, Thomas countered. This is too important to Vance. He'd commit resources. They advanced cautiously, using shadows and abandoned equipment for cover. As they neared the main floor, voices became audible. Peering around a corner, Thomas got his first glimpse of Emma. She sat zip-tied to a chair in the center of the open space, surrounded by 4 men in tactical gear. Her face was defiant despite the fear she must be feeling. Pride surged through Thomas alongside a wave of protective rage. His granddaughter had courage he'd never acknowledged or nurtured, too afraid that embracing that part of her would mean exposing her to his dangerous past. Now that past had found her anyway. 4 inside, Ryan confirmed, surveying the scene. Plus the 4 outside. 8 total. Bad odds, Thomas noted grimly. Had worse in Kandahar, Ryan replied with a hint of gallows humor. Thomas checked his watch, 11:47 p.m. Time was running out. I need to get closer, he decided. Create a distraction on the east side, draw their attention. I'll approach from the west. Ryan looked skeptical. That's suicide. They'll have overlapping fields of fire. Got a better idea? Ryan thought for a moment, then said, Actually, yes, but you're not going to like it. He outlined his plan quickly, simple, direct, and incredibly risky. Thomas listened, recognizing elements of special operations doctrine mixed with street-level improvisation. That's insane, he said when Ryan finished. But it might work, Ryan countered, and it gives Emma the best chance. Thomas knew he was right. Okay, but if anything goes wrong, I'll get her out, Ryan promised. Whatever happens. They separated, Ryan moving toward the east exit while Thomas circled to approach from behind Emma's position. The jammer would be wearing off soon, returning their thermal signatures to the Reaper's monitoring equipment. Time was critical now. Thomas reached his position concealed behind a large piece of lumber-cutting equipment 20 yards from Emma. From here, he could see her face clearly, for the first time, the determined set of her jaw, the calculated way she observed her captors. So much like her grandmother. The leader of the Reapers checked his watch, then approached Emma again. Midnight, he announced. Your grandfather is late. He'll come, Emma said with quiet confidence. For your sake, I hope so. Etched, the man turned to his team. Prepare for exfiltration. If he's not here in 5 minutes, we move to contingency plan. Thomas knew what that meant. They'd take Emma to a secondary location, somewhere more secure where rescue would be nearly impossible. It was now or never. Thomas reached into his pocket and removed the USB drive containing James Lawson's journal. 15 years of silence, of running, of hiding the truth, all concentrated in this small device. He stepped out from behind the equipment, hands raised, the drive clearly visible in his palm. I'm here, he called out. Let her go. Every Reaper spun toward him, weapons raised. The leader held up a hand, keeping them from firing. Sergeant Garrett, he said, using Thomas's old rank. Right on time after all. Emma's eyes widened. Gramps, no. It's okay, Emma, Thomas said, keeping his voice steady. Everything's going to be fine. The leader motioned for Thomas to approach. The journal, show me. Release my granddaughter first. That's not how this works. The leader nodded to one of his men who moved behind Emma and placed a pistol against her head. The journal, now. Thomas took a step forward, the USB drive extended. It's all here, everything James Lawson documented. The diamond smuggling, the coordination with insurgents, the payoffs to officials. He took another step. Names, dates, bank accounts. The leader's eyes narrowed behind his mask. Give it to me and the girl walks. I want your word, Thomas insisted. You're not in a position to negotiate. Thomas's gaze didn't waver. There's always a choice. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the leader nodded almost imperceptibly. Fine, my word. Give me the drive and she's free to go. Thomas took another step forward now, within 10 feet of Emma. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also the trust he wasn't sure he deserved. I'm sorry, Emma, he said softly. I should have told you everything a long time ago. Before she could respond, Thomas tossed the USB drive to the leader, who caught it with one hand. Now let her go, Thomas demanded. The leader pocketed the drive, then gave a small nod to his men. The Reaper behind Emma cut her zip ties but kept his gun trained on her. Stand up slowly, he instructed her. Emma rose unsteadily, rubbing her wrists. Her eyes never left her grandfather's face. Go to your grandfather, the leader ordered. Emma took a hesitant step forward, then another. Thomas watched her approach, his heart pounding. Just a few more steps. Something flashed in Emma's eyes, a warning. Thomas tensed, instincts kicking in. Now, the leader suddenly barked. Everything happened at once. The Reaper behind Emma grabbed her, pulling her back as a human shield. The other 3 raised their weapons at Thomas. The leader drew his own pistol, aiming it calmly at Thomas's head. Did you really think I'd keep my word to a dead man? He asked. Thomas didn't flinch. No, but I needed you to think I believed you. Before the leader could process this, the lights went out. Complete darkness engulfed the mill, followed immediately by a series of deafening explosions from outside Ryan's diversion. Thomas dropped to the floor as the first muzzle flashes lit up the darkness. Bullets whizzed overhead, the Reapers firing blindly at where he'd been standing. Years of SEAL training took over. Thomas rolled, finding cover behind a concrete pillar. He drew the Desert Eagle, waiting for his moment. Through the chaos of shouting and gunfire, he heard Emma cry out. The sound galvanized him, sending him into motion. He moved low and fast, using muzzle flashes to identify targets. The first Reaper went down with a shot to the leg, his weapon clattering away. The second turned too late, catching Thomas's elbow to the temple. More gunfire erupted from the east side of the building, Ryan engaging the perimeter guards who'd rushed in at the sound of commotion. Thomas moved toward Emma's last position, his eyes now adjusted to the darkness. He could make out Shape's movement, and there the silhouette of a man holding someone smaller. "Let her go," Thomas called out, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a predator. "Stay back," came the reply, the leader's voice using Emma as a shield. Thomas took careful aim. A headshot in this light was risky even for him with Emma so close. "Last chance," Thomas warned. "Release her or die where you stand." The leader backed toward an exit, dragging Emma with him. "You won't risk hitting her, not your precious granddaughter." He was right. Thomas couldn't take the shot, not without risking Emma. But someone else could. A single gunshot cracked from behind the leader. He jerked, then collapsed, taking Emma down with him. Ryan emerged from the shadows, his pistol still raised. "Clear," he called. Thomas rushed to Emma, pulling her from beneath the fallen Reaper. The leader had taken a perfect shot to the base of the skull, instant death. "Emma, are you hurt?" Thomas asked urgently, checking her for injuries. She shook her head, shock evident on her face. I don't think so." Her voice was remarkably steady. "You came for me." "Always," Thomas said, helping her to her feet. "I will always come for you." Ryan appeared beside them, breathing hard. "We need to move. More might be coming." "The others?" Thomas asked. "Two down, one escaped," Ryan reported. "The outside team scattered after the explosions." Thomas nodded. "The journal Ryan held up the USB drive. "Got it off him." The sound of sirens penetrated the night Sheriff Newman, arriving with whatever backup she'd managed to muster. As they made their way toward the exit, Emma suddenly stopped, turning to face her grandfather. "Was what he said true?" she asked. "About you not being a hero?" Thomas met her gaze steadily. "I'm no hero, Emma. Just a man who tried to protect his family and failed." "That looks like success to me," Ryan said, gesturing around at the fallen Reapers. Emma stared at her grandfather for a long moment, then wrapped her arms around him in a fierce hug. "You came for me," she repeated. "That's all that matters." Thomas held her tight, feeling the weight of 15 years of silence beginning to lift. But as they exited the mill to meet Sheriff Newman's approaching vehicles, he knew this night's events had only escalated their danger. The journal was safe, but Vance Delaney was still alive. And as long as he lived, the truth remained a deadly weapon, one that could still destroy everything Thomas cared about. Dawn broke over Riverdale, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. Thomas sat on the porch of his house, cradling a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Inside, Emma slept finally after hours of questioning by Sheriff Newman and state police investigators. The night's events had sent shock waves through the small town. Deputy Miller was in stable condition at County General, ironically in a room not far from Vance Delaney's. The mill had become a crime scene, with 4 dead Reapers being processed by forensics teams. And through it all, Thomas's past had risen like a specter, demanding acknowledgement. The screen door creaked, and Ryan stepped out, carrying his own coffee. "Just got off the phone with Sheriff Newman," he said, taking a seat in the adjacent rocker. "State police have issued a bolo for the remaining Reapers. FBI is sending a team from the Helena office." Thomas nodded absently. "And Vance, under heavy guard. They're transferring him to a secure medical facility once he's stable enough to move." Ryan sipped his coffee. "He's not talking." "He won't," Thomas predicted. "Not to local law enforcement anyway. The USB drive might be enough. State Police Tech Unit is analyzing it now." Thomas stared into the distance where the American flag still flew over Garrett's timepieces downtown, a replacement Sarah had personally raised after learning what had happened to the original. "It won't be enough," he said quietly. "Not against Vance's connections. We need more." Ryan studied him. "You have something in mind?" It wasn't a question. Thomas turned to face him fully. I need to know where you stand, Ryan. Really stand. Your brother died because he chose truth over loyalty to a corrupt officer. Are you prepared to do the same? Ryan didn't hesitate. James was always the better man. Maybe it's time I followed his example. Thomas nodded satisfied. Then I need you to make a call. Reach out to the Vipers, the ones still loyal to Vance. Tell them you escaped police custody, that you have information about where I'm keeping the real journal. Ryan's eyes narrowed. You want to draw them out. I want to end this, once and for all. Thomas stood his decision made. 15 years ago, I chose silence to protect my family. It was the wrong choice. The only way to truly protect them is to bring everything into the light. That's a dangerous play, Ryan warned. The Vipers may be street-level tough guys, but some of them are former military. And if Vance has more Reapers on standby, then we'll be ready for them too. Thomas's voice hardened with resolution. No more running, no more hiding. The screen door opened again, and both men turned to see Emma standing there. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were clear and determined. I want to help, she said simply. Thomas shook his head immediately. Absolutely not. You've been through enough. This is my fight too, Emma insisted. They came into our home. They took me. They threatened you. She stepped forward. Whatever you're planning, I want in. Thomas recognized the expression on her face, the same stubborn determination he saw in the mirror every morning. It's too dangerous, he tried again. So is being kept in the dark, Emma countered. Isn't that what started all this, secrets, people not knowing what they're really facing? Ryan suppressed a smile. She's got you there. Thomas sighed, recognizing defeat. You can help with planning. That's it. Emma accepted this small victory with a nod. First, I think you both need to tell me everything. From the beginning. No more secrets. Inside, they gathered around the kitchen table. Thomas produced an old metal box from his go bag, opening it to reveal photographs, documents, and a dog tag identical to the one Ryan had given him at the shop. James gave me this before the ambush, Thomas explained, handing the tag to Ryan. Said if anything happened to him, I should get it to you someday. Ryan took it reverently, his fingers tracing the embossed name. Why didn't you? By the time I recovered from my injuries, Vance's narrative was already established. I was under investigation, my reputation destroyed. Finding you would have put a target on your back too. Thomas spread out the photographs, his old unit, 8 young men, and Vance standing before a makeshift flagpole in Iraq. 8th Special Warfare Unit, SEAL Team 3. He said, his voice softening with memory. Some of the finest men I ever served with. He pointed to each face, naming them Mike Daniels Communications, Steve Hudson Demolitions, Carlos Rodriguez Medic, Tom Wilson Sniper, Alan Parker Intelligence, Will Jackson Heavy Weapons, James Lawson Tech Specialist, and me Team Leader. Emma studied the photograph, seeing her grandfather as a younger man, harder, sharper, but with the same steady eyes. And him, she asked, pointing to Vance. Lieutenant Vance Delaney. Commanding officer. Thomas's expression darkened. West Point graduate. Connected family. Fast-tracked for promotion. What went wrong? Emma asked. Thomas exchanged glances with Ryan, then began the story, the full story, holding nothing back. He described the unit's operations in Fallujah, the gradual realization that something wasn't right with their patrol schedules, James's discovery of the diamond smuggling operation. Conflict diamonds, Thomas explained. Blood diamonds. Moving from Africa through Iraq, then to Europe and Asia. Worth millions on the black market. And Vance was facilitating this. Emma asked, trying to comprehend the scale of the betrayal. Thomas nodded. Using our unit as unwitting cover. Coordinating with local insurgent leaders, the same ones we were supposed to be fighting. He continued describing James's journal, the documented evidence, the plan to report it up the chain of command. But the next day, Thomas said, his voice growing hollow, we walked into an ambush. 8 of us went in. Only 3 came out. Me, Vance, and a young private who died of his wounds 2 days later. And no one believed you when you reported what Vance had done, Emma concluded. Worse than that, Thomas said grimly. Vance flipped the narrative. Claimed I'd abandoned my post, left my men to die while I sought cover. Said James had been delusional, paranoid. All right, but the journal was dismissed as potentially fabricated, and Vance's family connections ensured the investigation went his way. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. By the time I was cleared for duty, the official story was established. I was the coward who let his men die. Emma reached across the table, covering her grandfather's hand with her own. But you knew the truth. The truth, Thomas said bitterly, got 8 good men killed and nearly destroyed what was left of my family. Ryan had been silent during this recounting, his face a mask of controlled grief. Now he spoke, his voice tight. James wrote to me about you, he said. His letters never mentioned the diamond smuggling, probably for my protection, but he called you the best team leader he'd ever served under. Said you'd walk into hell for any of your men. Thomas looked up surprised. I should have known, Ryan continued. When Vance recruited me, told me his version of what happened, something never felt right. But I wanted so badly to connect with James's memory that I believed him. Vance is persuasive, Thomas acknowledged, and he offered you purpose when you needed it most. Emma had been studying the documents spread across the table, her quick mind piecing together the larger picture. So all of this, the Vipers coming to Riverdale, the attack on your shop, my kidnapping, it was about getting this journal, silencing you again. Thomas nodded. Vance built a new life after his discharge, used his connections, the money he'd skimmed from the diamond operation, to establish himself. The Vipers are just the public face of his organization. His real business is still arms and smuggling, all technically legal through shell companies and private security contracts. And if the truth about Fallujah came out, Ryan added, it would all crumble. Federal investigations, military inquiries, international charges. So what's the plan? Emma asked, a determined glint in her eye. How do we expose him? Thomas considered her question. The direct approach, turning the journal over to authorities, carried risks. Vance's connections might still shield him, and without corroborating testimony, it could be dismissed as fabricated evidence once again. We need Vance to incriminate himself, Thomas decided. Get him to confess on record. How? Ryan asked. He's under guard facing charges. He won't talk. He'll talk to me, Thomas said with certainty, if he believes I have something he wants badly enough. The journal, Emma realized. Thomas nodded. Vance thinks we have the only copy, but I made backups years ago stored in secure locations. What he doesn't know is that I've spent 15 years gathering additional evidence, financial records, communication logs, witness statements from others involved in the smuggling operation. Ryan looked impressed. You never stopped investigating. I stopped running, Thomas corrected. There's a difference. He outlined his plan. Ryan would contact the Vipers claiming to have escaped custody. He would tell them Thomas was planning to turn everything over to federal authorities, but first wanted to confront Vance personally at the hospital. The Vipers will try to stop you, Ryan pointed out, possibly with deadly force. I'm counting on it, Thomas replied. We'll coordinate with Sheriff Newman, set up a controlled environment. When they make their move, we'll have them on multiple charges: conspiracy, attempted murder, obstruction of justice. And Vance, Emma asked, we'll see his organization crumbling around him, his loyal soldiers arrested or turning on him. Thomas's expression was grimly satisfied. That's when I'll offer him a deal, a full confession, in exchange for certain considerations. Ryan nodded slowly, understanding the psychology. Backed into a corner, facing life in prison, or worse, he might take it. It's risky, Emma pointed out. A lot of moving parts, a lot that could go wrong. That's why you're staying far away from it, Thomas told her firmly. To his surprise, Emma didn't argue. Instead, she asked, what about after, if this works, if Vance confesses, what then? It was a question Thomas hadn't allowed himself to consider fully. For 15 years, his life had been defined by this secret, this burden. What would it mean to finally set it down? Then we rebuild, he said simply, together. As they continued planning, the weight of Thomas's past seemed to lift slightly, not gone, but shared now. No longer his burden alone. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across Riverdale. After 15 years of silence, Thomas Garrett had finally found his voice, and this time he intended to be heard. Sheriff Newman reacted to Thomas's plan exactly as expected, with professional skepticism and personal concern. Let me get this straight, she said, pacing her office. You want to use yourself as bait to draw out armed criminals, potentially in a hospital where innocent civilians could be caught in the crossfire. Thomas sat calmly across from her desk. With proper coordination and security measures, yes. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. I should arrest you just for suggesting it. You could, Thomas acknowledged, but then you'd lose your best chance at breaking this case wide open. Ryan, who had accompanied Thomas to the sheriff's station, added his perspective. The Vipers are still out there. So are the remaining Reapers. If we don't take control of the situation, they'll keep coming. Sarah knew they were right, which only increased her frustration. Even if I wanted to help, which I haven't decided yet, I don't have the resources. 2 deputies, one of whom is in the hospital with a gunshot wound. State police, Thomas suggested, and the FBI team that's on its way, who might not arrive for hours and who may not be interested in your vigilante justice scenario. Thomas leaned forward. This isn't about vigilante justice, Sheriff. It's about ending a threat to this town, to my family, to yours. Sarah stopped pacing, studying Thomas with new understanding. This is personal for you. Anurur, damn right it's personal, Thomas replied without apology. Vance Delaney has been haunting me for 15 years. He's threatened my granddaughter, attacked my business, terrorized my town. His voice hardened. And he got away with murdering 8 good men. So yes, it's personal. Ryan watched this exchange with interest. He'd spent years seeing Thomas Garrett through Vance's distorted lens, a coward, a traitor, a man who'd abandoned his men. Now he was seeing the real Thomas, a man who'd carried an impossible burden alone rather than risk others. Sarah seemed to reach a decision. I'll coordinate with state police, see what resources they can commit. She fixed Thomas with a stern look. But we do this by the book. No cowboy heroics, no improvisation. If at any point I think this is going off the rails, I shut it down. Clear, Thomas nodded. Clear. What about Emma? Sarah asked. After what happened, she needs protection. No one already arranged, Thomas assured her. My neighbor, Mr. Henderson, retired Marine Corps. She'll stay with him and his wife until this is over. Sarah made notes on her pad. And the hospital county general isn't exactly set up for this kind of operation. We don't need the whole hospital, Thomas explained. Just Vance's room and the surrounding corridors. Controlled access points, limited civilian exposure. And the Vipers. How can we be sure they'll bite? Ryan spoke up. I'll make it convincing. These guys aren't tactical geniuses, but they're loyal to Vance. If they think there's a chance to help him, they'll come. Sarah considered this. Timeline tonight, Thomas said firmly, before Vance is transferred to the secure facility. That's pushing it, Sarah protested. I need time to coordinate with state police, set up security protocols. We don't have time, Thomas countered. Every hour increases the risk that Vance calls in more Reapers, or that the Vipers decide to take matters into their own hands, possibly with Emma as a target again. Sarah recognized the logic even if she didn't like it. Fine, I'll make the calls. But I want everything documented, everything by the book. She pointed at Ryan. And you're technically in custody. I'm releasing you into Mr. Garrett's supervision, but one wrong move and you're back in a cell. Ryan nodded his acceptance of these terms. As they prepared to leave, Sarah called after them. Thomas. It was the first time she'd used his first name. For what it's worth, I believe you. About Fallujah, about Vance. Always did. Thomas paused, surprised. Why? My father was a Marine. He taught me to recognize real soldiers from pretenders. She met his gaze steadily. You're the real thing. The acknowledgement hit Thomas harder than he expected. After 15 years of doubt, of whispers of questioning his own actions, here was someone who simply believed him, not because of evidence or journals, but because she recognized the truth in him. Thank you, he said quietly. Outside the station, Ryan observed. She's good people. Yes, Thomas agreed. One of the best. They walked toward Thomas's truck, the day's task clearly defined. Ryan would make contact with the Vipers setting the trap. Thomas would prepare for his confrontation with Vance, gathering the evidence he'd accumulated over 15 years. And somewhere in County General Vance Delaney waited unaware that the reckoning he'd tried so hard to avoid was finally at hand. Emma Garrett was not happy about being sidelined. This is ridiculous, she protested as Thomas escorted her to the Hendersons' house. I can help. I'm not some fragile doll that needs protection. No one's saying you are. Thomas replied patiently. But you've been through enough already. So have you, Emma countered. More than enough. That's why I should be there. Thomas stopped walking, turning to face his granddaughter fully. Emma, listen to me. Last night when those men took you, his voice caught slightly. That was my fault. My past putting you in danger. I won't risk that again. It wasn't your fault, Emma insisted. It was Vance's fault, and those men who chose to follow him. Maybe, Thomas conceded, but the fact remains the safest place for you is away from me until this is over. Emma's expression softened, seeing the guilt and fear her grandfather was carrying. You know what Mom used to say about you before she died? Thomas shook his head, surprised by the change of subject. She said you were the strongest man she ever knew. Not because you were tough or brave, though you were both. Emma met his gaze steadily, but because you carried burdens no one else could see and never let them break you. Thomas swallowed hard, memories of his daughter-in-law Emma's mother surfacing unexpectedly. She had been insightful, compassionate, taken far too soon by cancer. Your mother was kind, he said softly. Too kind sometimes. She was right, Emma insisted, and now I understand what she meant. All these years you've carried this alone, the truth about Fallujah, the weight of those men's deaths, the threat of Vance finding us. She took his hand. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. Sukun. Thomas looked down at their joined hands, her youth against his age, her hope against his caution. I'll be careful, he promised, and when this is over, no more secrets. We start fresh. Emma nodded, accepting this compromise. Deal. The Hendersons welcomed Emma warmly. Mr. Henderson exchanging a knowing look with Thomas, one warrior to another, a silent promise to protect what was precious. As Thomas prepared to leave, Emma hugged him fiercely. Come back, she whispered. Whatever happens, just come back. Count on it, Thomas replied, holding her tight. Garrett men always keep their promises. The drive back to town gave Thomas time to reflect on the day's developments. Ryan had gone to make contact with the Vipers, setting their plan in motion. Sheriff Newman was coordinating with state police for the hospital operation, and Thomas was finally, after 15 years, confronting his past head-on. He stopped by his shop, retrieving the final pieces of evidence he'd gathered over the years. Financial records tracing diamond transactions to shell companies linked to Vance. Statements from a former insurgent commander obtained through military contacts. Personnel records showing key officials who'd been paid to look the other way. As he gathered these materials, Thomas's gaze fell on the display case of memorial watches, one for each man lost in Fallujah. He'd crafted them meticulously, each engraved with a name, and the date April 15, 2007. Today, those watches represented more than memorials. They were his witnesses, silent testaments to a truth long buried, but never forgotten. Thomas was placing the documents in his go-bag when the shop's bell chimed. He turned instantly alert to find Sheriff Newman in the doorway. State police are on board, she reported. 6 officers, tactical equipment. They'll secure the hospital corridors and critical access points. And the FBI, 2 agents en route from Helena, but they won't arrive until tomorrow. Sarah hesitated, then added, They're skeptical about your plan. See it as a personal vendetta rather than legitimate law enforcement. Thomas nodded, unsurprised. It can be both. Sarah didn't disagree. Any word from Ryan? Not yet. He knows to be careful with the contact. You trust him? Sarah asked bluntly. A man who was Vance's right hand less than 24 hours ago. Thomas considered the question seriously. I trust that he wants to know the truth about his brother's death. Everything else flows from that. Sarah accepted this with a nod. The hospital administrator is concerned about security risks to other patients. We're moving everyone from Vance's wing as a precaution. Good. Fewer civilians in the crossfire if things go wrong. If things go wrong, Sarah emphasized, I'm pulling the plug. No heroic last stands, no personal showdowns. We're doing this by the book. Thomas smiled slightly. Yes, ma'am. His phone buzzed with a text message from Ryan. Contact made. They're in 8 p.m. Thomas showed the message to Sarah. It's on. She checked her watch, just past 2 p.m. 6 hours to finalize preparations. She straightened, professional determination evident in her bearing. Let's do this right. As Sarah left to coordinate with state police, Thomas remained in his shop for a moment longer. His gaze returned to the memorial watches, each representing a man who had trusted him with their life. Men who deserved justice. After 15 years of silence, Thomas Garrett was finally ready to speak for them. Tirpurnium County General Hospital normally saw little action beyond the occasional farm accident or hunting mishap. Tonight, however, its third-floor east wing hummed with controlled tension. State police officers in tactical gear secured key positions, stairwells, elevators, corridor intersections. Sheriff Newman coordinated from a makeshift command post in an empty patient room radio chatter, keeping her updated on all movements. In room 312, Vance Delaney lay handcuffed to his hospital bed, his gunshot wound professionally bandaged. Despite his predicament, he maintained an air of arrogant confidence, as if his current circumstances were merely a temporary inconvenience. Thomas observed him through the small window in the door, studying the man who had haunted his life for 15 years. Vance had aged well, still fit his salt and pepper hair, giving him a distinguished appearance that belied his corrupt soul. "He's been asking for legal representation," Sarah informed Thomas as she joined him. "Claims he's being held illegally." "Has he said anything about the Reapers? The kidnapping?" Sarah shook her head. "Denies all knowledge. Says he was in custody when it happened, couldn't possibly be involved." "Typical Vance," Thomas muttered. "Always with a prepared alibi." Ryan approached from the elevator, now dressed in civilian clothes rather than his viper cut. State police had outfitted him with a concealed wire to document any incriminating statements from his former associates. "They're coming," he reported. "6 of them, including Hawkins, Vance's new second-in-command. They think I escaped police custody and discovered you're planning to turn evidence over to the FBI." "Where will they enter?" Sarah asked. "Service entrance on the ground floor, maintenance access to avoid the main lobby." Sarah immediately radioed this information to her teams. "Timing," Ryan checked his watch. 20 minutes, maybe less." Thomas nodded, mentally preparing. "Remember, we need them to make the first move. Attempted assault, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. We're building a case that even Vance's connections can't dismiss." Sarah gave final instructions to her officers, then turned to Thomas. "You're sure about this part of the plan? Being alone with Vance?" "It's the only way to get him talking," Thomas replied. "He won't incriminate himself with others present." "We'll be monitoring," Sarah reminded him, indicating the small microphone concealed in Thomas's jacket. "Anything goes wrong, we're in there." Thomas appreciated her concern, but knew this was something he had to do himself. 15 years of silence, of running, had led to this moment. "It's time," he said simply. Sarah nodded to the state police officer guarding Vance's door. The officer stepped aside, allowing Thomas to enter. Vance looked up as the door opened, mild surprise registering on his face. "Thomas Garrett," he said, his voice carrying the same commanding tone it had in Iraq. "They said you were in town, but I didn't believe it. Thought you'd be halfway to Canada by now." Thomas closed the door behind him, taking measured steps into the room. "Running days are over, Vance." "So I see." Vance gestured to his handcuffed wrist with his free hand. "Come to gloat, not very sporting of you." "Not gloating," Thomas replied, taking a seat beside the bed. "Just finishing what started 15 years ago." Vance's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what might that be?" "Justice. For James Lawson. For all of them." A dismissive chuckle escaped Vance. "Still clinging to that fantasy, are we, the heroic Thomas Garrett, seeking justice for fallen comrades?" His voice hardened. "We both know what really happened in Fallujah." "Yes," Thomas agreed calmly. "We do. That's why I'm here." He reached into his jacket, removing a folder containing selected pages from James's journal and the supporting evidence he'd gathered. He laid these on the bed within Vance's reach. "What's this supposed to be?" Vance asked, not touching the folder. "The truth, in black and white." Betrayal. Thomas opened the folder, revealing the first page, a handwritten entry from James Lawson's journal, dated April 14, 2007. James documented everything: Vance, the diamond smuggling, the coordination with insurgent leaders, the payoffs to officials who looked the other way. Vance's expression remained neutral, but Thomas detected a slight tension in his jaw. Fabrications, the delusions of a disturbed young man. "That's what you claimed 15 years ago," Thomas acknowledged. "Might have worked then, won't work now." He flipped to another document, financial records showing transfers between shell companies linked to Vance and known diamond brokers in Europe. Took years to assemble these, Thomas continued, following the money trail connecting the dots. Vance glanced at the documents, then away, affecting boredom. Anyone can create fake papers. No court would accept this. Perhaps not on their own, Thomas agreed, but combined with testimony from others involved. He produced another document, a sworn statement from a former insurgent commander, now living under protection in Jordan. Abdul al-Rashid remembers you quite well, Vance. Remembers the deals you made, the coordinates you provided for our patrol routes. Something flickered in Vance's eyes, the first sign of genuine concern. You've been busy, he observed, voice slightly tighter than before. 15 years, Thomas replied, gathering evidence, building a case, waiting for the right moment. Vance seemed to recalculate his position. What do you want, Thomas? Money, revenge? What's your play here? I told you, justice. Justice, Vance echoed with a humorless laugh. For men long dead, for a mission no one remembers, the world's moved on, Thomas. I haven't, Thomas said simply, and neither have the families of those men, their wives, their children. He paused meaningfully. Their brothers. Understanding dawned in Vance's eyes. Ryan, you turned Ryan against me. I told him the truth, Thomas corrected, about his brother, about you. Vance's composure slipped further. Ryan was nothing when I found him. A drunk of failure, dishonoring his brother's memory. I gave him purpose, structure. You used him, Thomas countered. Used James's memory to manipulate him, just like you used all of us in Iraq. Vance stared at Thomas for a long moment. Then his expression shifted, the mask of civility, dropping away to reveal the calculating officer Thomas had known in Fallujah. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Vance said, his voice low with menace. My organization extends far beyond the Vipers. I have connections you can't begin to imagine in government, in military circles, in international business. I know exactly who you are, Thomas replied calmly. A corrupt officer who betrayed his men for profit. A criminal who spent 15 years building an empire on blood money. Vance leaned forward as far as his handcuffed wrist would allow. And what does that make you? The coward who ran away, the man who abandoned his post when things got tough. Thomas refused to rise to the bait. We both know that's not what happened. Do we? Vance's smile was cold. I have statements from 3 Iraqi civilians who saw you fleeing the ambush site. I have after-action reports questioning your whereabouts during critical minutes of the engagement. Fabrications, Thomas said, using Vance's own word against him. Witnesses you paid off, reports you influenced through your connections. For a moment, Vance seemed ready to continue the denials. Then, as if making a tactical decision, he relaxed back against his pillows. You know what your problem is, Thomas. You think too small. Always did. His tone shifted to one almost of regret. Those diamonds weren't just about personal profit. They were financing operations critical to American interests in the region. Black ops that nobody wanted on the official books. Thomas stared at him, disbelief evident. You're claiming this was sanctioned official policy. Not officially, of course. That's the point of black operations. Vance's confidence seemed to grow as he spun his narrative. Certain elements within the intelligence community needed untraceable funding. The Diamond Pipeline provided that. Yes, insurgents benefited temporarily, but the long-term strategic advantage? 8 men died. Thomas cut him off, voice hard with controlled anger. American soldiers under your command. For what strategic advantage? Vance's expression hardened. Casualties are part of war. You know that better than most. Not like this, Thomas insisted. Not betrayed by their own commanding officer. I made the hard call, Vance shot back. The one you weren't willing to make. That's why I was the officer and you were the NCO. Thomas leaned forward. Are you admitting you led us into that ambush deliberately? A calculating look crossed Vance's face. I'm explaining context you've never understood. There were bigger things at stake than one SEAL team. Outside in the corridor, Sarah Newman listened to this exchange via Thomas's concealed microphone, recording every word. She exchanged glances with the state police captain beside her. They were getting closer to a confession, but not quite there. Inside the room, Thomas pressed his advantage. James figured it out, didn't he? That's why he had to die. Lawson was a security risk. Vance replied, his tone disturbingly matter-of-fact. He stumbled onto information he couldn't possibly understand, would have compromised operations that saved countless American lives. So you arranged the ambush, gave the insurgents our coordinates. Vance eyed Thomas with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. You've carried this for 15 years. Why come forward now? Why not stay hidden in your little town, fixing watches, playing the silent martyr? Because you found me, Thomas answered. You brought this to my doorstep, to my family. Understanding dawned in Vance's eyes. The granddaughter. This is about her. This is about justice, Thomas repeated. But yes, when you threatened Emma, you crossed a line. Vance smiled suddenly, a predatory expression. And now you think you have me cornered. The evidence, the testimony, you think it's enough to bring me down. I know it is. Then why are you here, Thomas? Why the private conversation? Why not just turn everything over to the FBI? It was a perceptive question, one that revealed Vance's strategic mind was still functioning despite his situation. Because I'm offering you a deal, Thomas said finally. Vance's eyebrows rose. A deal? A full confession? Names, dates, details. Everything about the diamond smuggling operation, the ambush, the cover-up afterward. Thomas leaned forward. In exchange for consideration during your sentencing, possibly protection from certain international parties who might want you eliminated once the truth comes out. Vance studied Thomas with new interest. And why would you offer me that after 15 years of hatred? I don't hate you, Vance, Thomas said truthfully. I pity you, but more importantly, I want the full truth on record, not just for me, but for the families of those men, for their legacy. Before Vance could respond, the room's phone rang the signal from Sarah that the Vipers had entered the building and were approaching the third floor. Thomas stood. Think about it. I'll be back for your answer. As he turned to leave, Vance called after him. They're coming for you, aren't they, my men? That's why you're really here, using yourself as bait. Thomas paused at the door. Like I said, running days are over. In the corridor, Sarah briefed him quickly. 6 Vipers armed moving up the service stairs. Ryan's engaging them now, wearing a wire. Thomas nodded. Get your people in position. Remember, we need them to make the first move. And you, I'll be in the waiting area at the end of the hall, visible but with cover nearby. Sarah didn't like it but understood the tactical necessity. Be careful. Thomas moved to the designated position, a small waiting area with clear sight lines to both the elevators and the service stairwell. He sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, positioned to appear vulnerable while actually having quick access to cover behind a nursing station. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. From his position, Thomas could see state police officers stationed strategically along the corridor, some in uniform, others in plain clothes disguised as hospital staff. Then the service door opened, and Ryan emerged, his expression tense. Behind him came 6 men in Viper cuts, led by a heavy-set figure Thomas recognized as Hawkins, Vance's new lieutenant. That's him, Ryan said, pointing toward Thomas. Garrett! Hawkins surveyed the seemingly empty corridor, eyes narrowed with suspicion. No cops. Shift change, Ryan explained. Skeleton crew for the next 20 minutes. Thomas remained seated, watching their approach with outward calm. Inside, however, his body was coiled with readiness, prepared for whatever came next. Thomas Garrett, Hawkins called out, striding forward. Heard a lot about you. Wish I could say the same, Thomas replied evenly. Hawkins stopped a few feet away, flanked by his men. Ryan here says you're planning to take evidence to the feds. Evidence against Vance. That's right. Can't let that happen. Hawkins' hand moved to his waistband where a pistol was poorly concealed beneath his cut. Where is it? The journal, the evidence, whatever you've got. Thomas nodded toward his jacket pocket. Right here. Everything needed to put Vance away for life. Hand it over, Hawkins demanded. Nice and slow. Yuri, and if I don't? Hawkins drew his weapon, pointing it directly at Thomas. Then things get messy. It was the moment they'd been waiting for, a clear threat recorded and witnessed. Thomas raised his hand slowly. Easy, he said. Let's talk about this. Nothing to talk about, Hawkins growled. The evidence, now. Before Thomas could respond, Sarah's voice rang out from behind the nursing station. Police, drop your weapons? Simultaneously, state police officers emerged from concealed positions, weapons trained on the Vipers. Hawkins's face contorted with rage. He swung his pistol toward Thomas, finger tightening on the trigger. Thomas dove for cover as shots erupted, not from Hawkins but from Ryan, who had drawn his own concealed weapon and fired at Hawkins's hand, sending the gun clattering to the floor. Chaos erupted in the narrow corridor. Most of the Vipers surrendered, immediately dropping to their knees with hands raised. But Hawkins and one other made a break for the service door. "Stop them!" Sarah shouted, moving from her position. Thomas was already in pursuit, his body responding with the automatic efficiency of decades of training. He tackled the second Viper, bringing him down hard on the hospital floor. Ahead, Hawkins crashed through the service door, directly into the arms of waiting state police officers. Within moments, it was over. The Vipers were in custody, no shots fired except Ryan's controlled disarming of Hawkins. Thomas picked himself up, accepting Sarah's offered hand. "Everyone all right?" "All secure," she confirmed. "No injuries." She eyed Ryan with newfound respect. "Nice shooting." Ryan holstered his weapon, a backup piece Sarah had reluctantly allowed him given his experience. "Aimed for his hand. Didn't want to kill him." Thomas nodded approval. "The recording monitor got it all," Sarah confirmed. Hawkins's threat, the attempted assault, combined with Ryan's testimony and the wire recording of their earlier planning, it's solid conspiracy charges at minimum. State police began processing the captured Vipers, reading them their rights and securing them for transport. "And Vance?" Thomas asked. "Heard the commotion, I'm sure," Sarah replied. "But his room was secured throughout. He's going nowhere." So Thomas glanced down the corridor toward room 312. "I need to finish our conversation." Sarah held up a hand. "Hold on. We need to clear the scene, document everything properly." "This won't wait," Thomas insisted. "Vance is calculating his options right now. If we give him time to think, to strategize, we'll lose our best chance at a confession." Sarah recognized the logic, even if procedure suggested otherwise. 5 minutes, she conceded. "We're still recording." Thomas nodded, already moving toward Vance's room. When he entered, Vance was sitting up in bed, alert despite his injury. From his expression, Thomas could tell he'd heard enough of the commotion to understand what had happened. "Your rescue party seems to have run into trouble," Thomas observed, closing the door behind him. Vance's eyes were calculating. "Apparently." Hawkins' 5 other Vipers, all in custody. Conspiracy, attempted assault weapons charges. None. Thomas resumed his seat beside the bed. "The trap worked perfectly." "And Ryan?" Vance asked. "I assume he was your inside man." "He made his choice. Chose his brother's truth over your lies." Vance absorbed this, his expression betraying little. "So what now? Your evidence, their testimony, you think that's enough?" "Combined with your confession, it would be ironclad." A dry laugh escaped Vance. "Still pushing for that, are you?" "Why would I confess now? My position hasn't changed." "Hasn't it?" Thomas challenged. "Your organization is crumbling. Your lieutenants arrested, your reapers either dead or scattered, and the evidence against you grows stronger by the hour." He leaned forward. "Your connections, Vance, the ones you're counting on to save you, how loyal will they remain when the full story breaks? The diamond smuggling, the deliberate sacrifice of American soldiers, the years of criminal enterprise afterward." Something shifted in Vance's expression, the first hint of genuine doubt. Thomas pressed his advantage. "The deal still stands. Full confession consideration during sentencing, possible protection, or I turn everything over to the FBI. Every document, every statement, every financial record. Let the chips fall where they may." Thomas's voice hardened. "Including with your international partners, who I imagine won't be pleased to learn about your current predicament." Vance stared at Thomas for a long moment, his mind clearly racing through scenarios, calculating odds, seeking advantage. "You've changed, Thomas," he said finally. "The man I knew in Fallujah would never be this calculating." 15 years changes a person," Thomas replied. "Especially 15 years of looking over your shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up." Vance nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision. "All right. You want a confession? I'll give you one. Full disclosure, every detail you want." Thomas couldn't quite believe it was happening. After 15 years, Vance was finally going to admit the truth. "In return," Vance continued, "I want witness protection, new identity security, detail the works, and immunity from international prosecution." "That's beyond my authority." Thomas said truthfully, but I'll advocate for it. It's in everyone's interest for the full truth to come out. Vance settled back against his pillows. Then start recording. This is going to take a while. Thomas knew Sarah was already capturing every word via his concealed microphone, but he pulled out his phone and set it to record as well, a visible confirmation for Vance. Start at the beginning, Thomas prompted. April 2007, the diamond smuggling operation. And Vance did. In precise, methodical detail, he laid out the entire operation, how it began as a small-scale opportunity to profit from the chaos of war, then expanded into a sophisticated smuggling network. He named contacts, routes, methods of concealment and transport. More damning, he described the deliberate ambush that killed Thomas's unit, how he'd provided coordinates to insurgent leaders, ensuring maximum casualties while positioning himself to survive. James Lawson was the primary target. Vance confirmed, his voice disturbingly clinical. He'd discovered too much, was planning to report up the chain of command. The others were collateral damage. And me, Thomas asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Was I supposed to die too? Vance nodded. You were too observant, too loyal to your men. A risk I couldn't afford. A hint of grudging respect entered his tone. But you survived, fought your way out even wounded, then became the perfect scapegoat when I needed one. The confession continued, detailing the cover-up afterward. The witnesses bribed, reports altered, investigators pressured or paid off. Your own reputation made it easier, Vance noted. The ghost of Fallujah, they called you. Known for appearing where least expected, achieving the impossible. Made it simpler to paint you as unstable, unreliable in crisis. As Vance spoke, Thomas felt a strange sense of lightness, as if each revelation, each admitted crime, lifted some of the weight he'd carried for 15 years. The truth finally spoken aloud was both vindication and release. When Vance finally finished, the silence in the hospital room felt charged with significance. 15 years of lies, of running, of doubt, all dispelled by this clinical confession. I have upheld my end, Vance said finally. Now you uphold yours. Thomas nodded, stopping the recording on his phone. I will. The FBI team arrives tomorrow morning. I'll make sure they understand the terms we've discussed. As he stood to leave, Vance called after him. One thing I never understood, Thomas. Why didn't you fight harder after Fallujah? When they were questioning your actions, why disappear? Why not push for the truth? Thomas paused at the door. My wife was dying. My son needed me. And you'd made it clear what happened to people who threatened your operation? He met Vance's gaze steadily. Some battles weren't worth the cost. And now Emma is all I have left. And you threatened her. Thomas's voice carried the quiet certainty of absolute resolve. That made it very simple. He left without waiting for Vance's response, closing the door on 15 years of silence and shadow. In the corridor, Sarah was waiting, her expression a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal amazement. We got it all, she confirmed. Every word. It's over, Thomas. But Thomas knew better. It wasn't over, not yet. The confession was only the beginning. Now came the hard part, rebuilding a life defined for so long by secrets and fear. As they walked toward the elevator, Sarah asked, What now for you, I mean? Thomas considered the question. For 15 years, his life had been shaped by Vance Delaney's shadow, by the need to stay hidden, to protect his family, to guard the truth. Now that shadow was lifting, revealing possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to consider. Now, he said slowly, I go home to my granddaughter, and we start again. The elevator doors closed, carrying them away from the past and toward whatever future awaited. Dawn broke over Riverdale, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and amber. Thomas Garrett stood on his front porch, coffee in hand, watching the first light touch the distant mountains. For the first time in 15 years, he felt the absence of a weight he'd carried for so long. He'd almost forgotten what it was like to stand unburdened. Inside, Emma still slept, exhausted from the emotional reunion the night before, when Thomas had finally returned from the hospital with news that it was over, that Vance had confessed, that the truth was finally known. The screen door creaked as Ryan Lawson stepped out carrying his own mug of coffee. Can't sleep, he asked, joining Thomas at the railing. Haven't really tried, Thomas admitted. Too much on my mind. Ryan nodded, understanding. FBI team arrives in 3 hours. State police want us both for formal statements. And you? What happens with you? Ryan sipped his coffee, considering. Prosecutors offering immunity in exchange for testimony against the Vipers and Vance. Sheriff Newman is vouching for me, says my assistance was instrumental. A small smile touched his lips. Might avoid prison after all. Good, Thomas said sincerely. James would be proud. Ryan looked away, emotion briefly visible on his face. I've spent 10 years trying to honor his memory, and all I did was serve the man who killed him. You didn't know, Thomas reminded him. Vance is manipulative, convincing. He fooled a lot of people for a long time. Not you, Ryan observed. You always knew the truth. And what good did it do me? Thomas sighed. 15 years in hiding, a life built on silence and fear. They watched the sunrise in companionable silence, two men connected by shared trauma and newfound understanding. What will you do now? Ryan finally asked. After the FBI interviews the legal proceedings, when it's really over? It was a question Thomas had been asking himself throughout the sleepless night. Rebuild, he said simply, with Emma, here in Riverdale. Not returning to service. Ryan seemed surprised. With your name cleared, your record restored, you could... I'm 70 years old, Ryan. Thomas interrupted with a small laugh. My fighting days are done. Sure, there are other ways to serve, Ryan pointed out. Consulting, training, mentorship. Thomas considered this. He'd spent so long defining himself by what he was running from that he'd rarely thought about what he might be running toward. Perhaps, he conceded, but right now my priority is Emma, giving her the stability she deserves. Inside the house, they heard movement, Emma waking, starting her day. Thomas felt a surge of protectiveness, of love for the granddaughter who had shown such courage throughout this ordeal. She's stronger than you think, Ryan observed, noting Thomas's expression. Reminds me of you, actually. God help her, Thomas replied with a soft chuckle. The screen door opened again, and Emma emerged, still in pajamas, her hair tousled from sleep. Morning, she yawned, stealing Thomas's coffee mug. Why does everyone look so serious? I thought we were supposed to be celebrating. Thomas and Ryan exchanged glances, then smiled. She was right, of course. After 15 years of darkness, this was a moment for light. You're right, Thomas acknowledged. This is a good day. The first of many, Emma added, bumping her shoulder against his affectionately. As they prepared breakfast together, the house felt different somehow, lighter, more open. The weight of secrets had been lifted, allowing room for simple joys, for normal family interactions. Sheriff Newman arrived as they were finishing bringing news from the hospital. Vance is being transferred this morning, she reported, accepting the offered coffee. Federal marshals are taking him to a secure facility in Denver pending formal charges. Any pushback from his connections? Thomas asked. Sarah shook her head. Not so far. His confession was comprehensive, implicated a lot of powerful people. They're probably all scrambling to distance themselves. And the Vipers, Ryan asked. State police raided their compound at the mill last night. Found weapons, drugs, evidence linking them to criminal activities across 3 states. Sarah looked satisfied. They're done in Riverdale, done everywhere probably. It was surreal, Thomas thought, listening to reports of Vance's empire crumbling. For 15 years, he'd lived in the shadow of that power, believing it unreachable, unbeatable. The FBI team wants to meet you both at the station at 10, Sarah continued. They've reviewed the preliminary evidence and recordings. They're impressed. Thomas nodded, though his thoughts were already moving beyond the formalities of statements and testimonies. What about a memorial, he asked suddenly, for the men from Fallujah? Now that the truth is known, they deserve proper recognition. Sarah seemed surprised by the question, but quickly recovered. I'm sure that can be arranged. The military will want to make amends given the circumstances. I'd like to be involved, Ryan said quietly. For James. Of course, Thomas agreed. We'll do it right. Honor them properly. Emma, who had been listening silently, spoke up. What about the flag, the one from Fallujah that was burned? A shadow crossed Thomas's face. Gone, he said simply, but perhaps it's time for a new one, a new beginning. As Sarah prepared to leave, she paused at the door. One more thing. The town council is meeting this afternoon. They want to formally apologize for doubting you, for the whispers, the suspicions over the years. Thomas waved this away. Not necessary. They didn't know. Still, Sarah insisted, it matters to them. To make it right. After she left, Thomas found himself drawn to the window, looking out at Riverdale, the town that had been his sanctuary and his prison for 15 years. The place had a different feel now, as if the air itself was clearer. "What are you thinking, Gramps?" Emma asked, coming to stand beside him. "Thinking it might be nice to finally belong here," he replied, fully openly, no more shadows. Emma squeezed his hand. "You always belonged, even when you didn't know it." The FBI interviews were thorough but respectful. Two agents, a senior investigator named Rivera and a younger agent specializing in financial crimes, took Thomas and Ryan through their statements multiple times, clarifying details, establishing timelines. "Your documentation is impressive, Mr. Garrett," Agent Rivera noted, reviewing the evidence Thomas had gathered over 15 years. "Methodical, comprehensive." "Had a lot of time to be thorough," Thomas replied. "This will be a complex case," Rivera continued. "International implications, potential diplomatic complications. Vance's confession gives us a strong foundation, but we'll need your continued cooperation." "Whatever you need," Thomas assured him. "And the deal we discussed?" Ryan asked. "For Vance," Rivera exchanged glances with his colleague. "Being considered at the highest levels, his information is valuable, particularly regarding international smuggling networks and corruption within military ranks." "But," Thomas prompted, hearing the unspoken reservation. "But 8 American servicemen died," Rivera said bluntly. "There's significant pressure to make an example of him." Thomas understood completely. Whatever deal might be struck, Vance Delaney would never walk free again. 15 years too late perhaps, but justice was finally in motion. As they prepared to leave the station, Ryan pulled Thomas aside. "I've been thinking," he said hesitantly, "about what happens next. For me." Thomas waited, sensing Ryan had more to say. "I can't stay in Riverdale," Ryan continued. "Too many connections to Vance, to the Vipers. People won't forget quickly." "Where will you go?" Ryan shrugged. "Not sure yet, but before I do—" He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "James's journal, the original. If it still exists, I'd like to have it. To read his words, understand what he discovered." Thomas studied Ryan's face, seeing the need there, not just for closure, but for connection to the brother he'd lost. "It exists," Thomas confirmed. "Not in the shop safe that was a decoy, as I said. The real journal is in a safety deposit box in Billings, under your name." Ryan's eyes widened in surprise. "Under my name? How?" "I opened it 15 years ago," Thomas explained. "Used your military ID information from James's personal effects. Thought someday, if things ever got resolved, you should be the one to have it." Emotion passed across Ryan's face, gratitude, grief, something like redemption. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means everything." They parted with a handshake that turned into a brief, firm embrace, the understanding between warriors who had finally found peace in the truth. Back at home, Thomas found Emma sitting on the porch swing, a thoughtful expression on her young face. He joined her, the swing creaking gently beneath their combined weight. "Heavy thoughts?" he asked. "Just processing," she replied. "Everything that happened, everything I learned about you." She turned to face him directly. "Why didn't you ever tell me about being a SEAL, about Fallujah, about any of it?" Thomas sighed, considering his answer carefully. "At first it was about protection, keeping you and your father safe from Vance, from anyone who might use you to get to me." He paused, searching for the right words. "But later, I think, I was ashamed." "Ashamed?" Emma's brow furrowed in confusion. "But you didn't do anything wrong. You tried to save those men." "Not ashamed of my actions in Fallujah," Thomas clarified. "Ashamed that I ran, that I chose silence over fighting for the truth." His voice softened. "That I allowed those men's memory to be tarnished by lies, all to protect myself." "You were protecting your family," Emma insisted. "Dad, Mom, me." "Perhaps," Thomas acknowledged, "but there's a fine line between protection and hiding. I'm not sure I always stayed on the right side of it." They rocked in silence for a moment, the gentle rhythm soothing. "What happens now?" Emma finally asked. "With Vance gone, the Vipers disbanded. What changes?" Thomas considered the question. "Everything and nothing," he replied. "The shop still needs running. You still have school, Life goes on. He smiled slightly. Just with fewer secrets between us. Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture that reminded Thomas painfully of her father, his son gone too soon. I'd like to know them, she said softly. The men from your unit, their stories, who they were. Thomas's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. For 15 years, he'd carried the memory of those men alone, never speaking their names aloud, never sharing the brotherhood they'd shared. I'd like that too, he managed. It's time they were remembered properly. The town meeting was scheduled for 5 p.m. at the community center. Thomas hadn't planned to attend despite Sarah's mention of the council's desire to apologize. Public acknowledgments made him uncomfortable, always had, even before Fallujah. But Emma insisted. The whole town will be there. It matters, Gramps. Not just to them, but to you, too. So he found himself seated in the front row of the hastily arranged assembly, Emma beside him, as Mayor Wilson addressed the gathered citizens of Riverdale. These past days have been among the most difficult in our town's history. The mayor began his usual nervous stammer, noticeably absent. We faced a threat none of us were prepared for, and we discovered truths about one of our own that many of us failed to recognize. Thomas shifted uncomfortably as heads turned in his direction. He'd spent 15 years avoiding attention, cultivating invisibility. This spotlight felt alien, invasive. Thomas Garrett has lived among us for 15 years, the mayor continued, running his shop, raising his granddaughter, being a quiet part of our community. What most of us didn't know, what he never chose to share, was his extraordinary past, his service, his sacrifice. The mayor detailed in careful terms the events surrounding Fallujah and the subsequent cover-up orchestrated by Vance Delaney. The gathered townsfolk listened in stunned silence, many casting disbelieving glances at the unassuming watchmaker they thought they'd known. When danger came to Riverdale, Mayor Wilson concluded, Thomas Garrett stood against it not because he sought recognition or acclaim, but because it was the right thing to do, because it is who he is. He turned to address Thomas directly. On behalf of the town council and all citizens of Riverdale, we offer our profound gratitude, our respect, and our sincere apology for any doubt we may have harbored. Applause erupted, tentative at first, then building to a sustained ovation as people rose to their feet. Thomas remained seated, uncomfortable with the attention, yet moved by the gesture. Emma squeezed his hand, pride evident in her expression. When the applause finally subsided, Mayor Wilson continued, in recognition of Mr. Garrett's service both to our country and to Riverdale, the council has unanimously approved the establishment of a memorial to be placed in Town Square, honoring the fallen members of SEAL Team 3 who lost their lives in Fallujah. More applause followed this announcement. Thomas felt a complex wave of emotions, gratitude, humility, and a deep sense that perhaps finally his men would receive the recognition they deserved. The meeting continued with updates on the Viper's disbandment, repairs to damaged properties, and community recovery efforts. Throughout, Thomas noticed the changed way people looked at him, with respect certainly, but also with a kind of awe that made him profoundly uncomfortable. As the meeting concluded, he was immediately surrounded by townspeople offering handshakes, thanks, and in some cases tearful apologies for past judgments. Never imagined we had a genuine hero in our midst, Bill from the hardware store said, pumping Thomas's hand enthusiastically. Not a hero, Thomas corrected gently. Just a soldier who survived. He extracted himself as quickly as politeness allowed, finding refuge outside where the evening air cooled his flushed face. Not one for the spotlight, are you? Sarah Newman's voice came from behind him. Thomas turned to find her leaning against the building, an understanding smile on her face. Never was, he confirmed. Even before everything. We'll get used to it, at least temporarily. Sarah nodded toward the community center, where people were still discussing the revelations. You're the biggest thing to hit Riverdale since they found gold in Miller's Creek back in '62. Thomas grimaced. Wonderful. Sarah laughed, then grew serious. For what it's worth, the recognition matters. Not just to you, but to the memory of your men. To their families. I know, Thomas acknowledged. Doesn't make it comfortable. Emma emerged from the building, joining them with a bounce in her step that had been missing during the tense days of Vance's presence. Gramps, they want to know if you'll help design the memorial, she reported. Mrs. Henderson suggested including photographs of all the men, and Mayor Wilson thought maybe their service records or... Slow down, Thomas interrupted gently. There's time for all that. Emma nodded, but her excitement remained evident. It's just, they'll finally be remembered. Properly. Thomas felt a swell of pride in his granddaughter's understanding of what truly mattered to him. Not personal recognition, but honor for those who had fallen honor too long denied. Yes, he agreed. They will. The three of them walked toward Main Street where Garrett's timepieces stood with its new flag flying proudly outside. Not the flag from Fallujah that was gone forever, but a new one symbolizing not just patriotism, but personal renewal. I've been thinking, Emma said as they approached the shop, about the memorial watches. Thomas glanced at her questioningly. The ones with the names, she explained. I thought maybe we could make duplicates. One set for the memorial, one set for the families. Thomas stopped walking, struck by the simple perfection of the idea. The watches had been his private tribute, his way of remembering men whose sacrifice had been overshadowed by lies. Sharing them now felt right. That's a fine idea, he managed emotion, making his voice rough. Sarah observed this exchange with a small smile. Like I said, she's stronger than you think. Sornan. Later, as Thomas closed the shop for the night, he found himself lingering before the display case of memorial watches. 8 timepieces each, meticulously crafted, each bearing a name and date. For 15 years, they had been his silent companions, his private reminder of truth in a world comfortable with lies. Now they would become public testaments, not just to lives lost, but to honor restored. Thomas's fingers traced the glass covering the watches, feeling a sense of completion. The circle was closing, the long silence was ending, and somewhere perhaps 8 warriors could finally rest in peace. 1 month later, Riverdale gathered once again, this time in Town Square, for the dedication of the Fallujah Memorial. The simple granite monument bore the names and photographs of 8 men, along with a replica of each memorial watch Thomas had crafted. Thomas stood slightly apart from the crowd, uncomfortable as always with public ceremonies. Beside him was Ryan Lawson, who had returned from Billings for the dedication. On Thomas's other side stood Emma Solemn in a blue dress that reminded Thomas painfully of her grandmother. The families of the fallen had been invited, those who could be located, those willing to attend. 6 had come traveling from across the country to honor men long dead, but finally properly remembered. James Lawson's parents were among them, elderly now, but dignified in their grief. Their reunion with Ryan had been emotional. 15 years of separation ended by the truth Thomas had preserved. Mayor Wilson's dedication speech was mercifully brief. Then Sheriff Newman read the names, each followed by the sharp report of a rifle fired by members of the local VFW chapter, Staff Sergeant Michael Daniels. Crack Petty Officer First Class Stephen Hudson. Crack Hospital Corpsman, Second Class Carlos Rodriguez. Crack Petty Officer Second Class Thomas Wilson. Crack Intelligence Specialist First Class Alan Parker. Crack Petty Officer First Class William Jackson. Crack Communications Specialist Second Class James Lawson. Crack Petty Officer Third Class David Mitchell. Crack Thomas closed his eyes as each name was read, each shot fired, seeing their faces, as they had been in life, young confident brothers in all but blood. After the ceremony, the families approached the memorial, touching names, photographs, studying the intricate watches that Thomas had recreated for each of them. Mrs. Lawson, James's mother, approached Thomas with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, clutching the watch bearing her son's name. "For remembering, for the truth." Thomas, never comfortable with words in such moments, merely nodded. "He was a fine soldier. He managed. And a good man." She smiled through her tears. "Ryan told us everything. How James discovered what Delaney was doing. How he came to you because he trusted you above all others." Her hand touched Thomas's arm gently. He was right to do so. As the families mingled, sharing memories and grief, long delayed, Thomas found himself drawn to the memorial itself. The granite gleamed in the autumn sunlight, the names etched deep enough to withstand decades of Montana weather. "It's good work," Ryan observed, joining him. "They'd approve, I think." Thomas nodded, emotion making speech difficult. "I've been offered a job," Ryan continued after a respectful pause. "Security consultant for a firm in Denver. Legitimate work using my background for something constructive. You'll take it." Ryan nodded. Fresh start. Chance to rebuild like you said. He glanced toward the Lawsons now talking with Emma. And stay connected to family again. Thomas understood. After years of being defined by Vance Delaney's influence, Ryan was reclaiming his life, his identity. James would be proud, Thomas said simply. Ryan smiled slightly. I think he'd be prouder of you, for keeping the faith all these years. As the gathering began to disperse, Thomas remained before the memorial, still processing the day's significance. Emma approached quietly, standing beside him in companionable silence. Dad would have liked this, she said finally. Being here, seeing you, acknowledged, vindicated. Thomas put his arm around her shoulders. Your father never doubted me, not even when others did. Because he knew you, Emma replied. The real you. Not just Thomas Garrett watchmaker, but Thomas Garrett warrior, protector. Thomas considered this the different facets of identity he'd kept separated for so long. The civilian and the soldier, the craftsman and the fighter, the grandfather and the SEAL. Maybe they're not so different, he mused. Maybe it's all just me. Emma smiled, understanding the revelation in his words. For 15 years, he'd compartmentalized his life, keeping his past separate from his present. Now perhaps integration was possible. Wholeness. As they walked home together, the autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet, Thomas felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The burden of silence had been lifted. The shadow of Vance Delaney's influence had been dispelled. What remained was simpler, clearer, a life to be lived, a granddaughter to raise, a community to belong to, fully, honestly at last. That evening, as had become their custom, Thomas and Emma sat on the porch swing watching dusk settle over Riverdale. The flag outside Garrett's timepieces was just visible in the distance, illuminated by the shop's exterior light standing firm against the gathering darkness. Sheriff Newman stopped by the shop today, Thomas mentioned. The FBI's case against Vance is proceeding. His testimony has already led to arrests in 3 countries. Emma nodded, absorbing this information. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if he'd never found you, if he'd just let the past stay buried? Thomas considered the question. Sometimes, he admitted, might have been easier in some ways, quieter. But not better, Emma suggested. No, Thomas agreed. Not better. They rocked in comfortable silence for several minutes, the creak of the swing's chains, a soothing counterpoint to the distant sounds of the town settling for the night. Gramps, Emma said suddenly, tell me about them, the men in your unit. Not just how they died, but how they lived. Thomas was surprised by the request, but found himself warming to it immediately. For 15 years, he'd carried these memories alone, never sharing them, never allowing them to be spoken aloud. Mike Daniels, he began, his voice soft with remembrance, was from Georgia, could play the guitar like nobody's business, used to serenade us on quiet nights with country songs his grandfather taught him. The stories flowed easily now, memories long suppressed finding voice at last. Thomas spoke of Steve Hudson's practical jokes, of Carlos Rodriguez's letters, home to his young wife, of Tom Wilson's uncanny ability to predict weather changes. He talked of Alan Parker's philosophical debates, of Will Jackson's collection of foreign coins. He shared James Lawson's pride in his younger brother, his dreams of starting a tech company after his service ended. And as he spoke, Thomas felt the final barriers within himself dissolving, the walls that had separated past from present, warrior from watchmaker, memory from life. The flag flew. The watches kept time. The names were remembered. After 15 years of silence, Thomas Garrett had found his voice again. And in that voice, 8 silent warriors lived once more. 6 months later, Thomas stood in Arlington National Cemetery, Emma beside him, as 8 headstones received new designations. No longer listed as casualties of combat action, but as victims of a war crime, their honor publicly, officially restored. The military ceremony was brief but powerful, acknowledging the truth after 15 years of official silence. Thomas, as the surviving member of the unit, received 8 posthumously awarded Purple Hearts to deliver to the families. Vance Delaney's court-martial had concluded 2 weeks earlier. Despite his cooperation, despite the valuable intelligence he'd provided on international smuggling networks, the verdict had been unequivocal, guilty on all counts. The sentence, life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Justice delayed, but not denied. As the ceremony concluded, a senior naval officer approached Thomas. Master Chief Garrett, he said, using Thomas's highest rank achieved before his discharge. The Secretary of the Navy wishes to speak with you. Thomas glanced at Emma, who nodded encouragement. I'll wait here, she assured him. The meeting was brief but significant. The Secretary offered a formal apology for the military's failure to properly investigate the Fallujah incident, for allowing Vance's narrative to stand unchallenged for so long. Your service record has been fully restored, Master Chief, the Secretary informed him. All commendations, including the Navy Cross, reinstated. The official history now reflects the truth. Thomas nodded acknowledgement, though these official rehabilitations meant less to him than the simple granite memorial in Riverdale, with its 8 names and 8 watches. There's something else, the Secretary continued. We're establishing a new ethics training program for special operations units focusing on command responsibility and moral courage in combat situations. We'd like you to consider serving as a consultant, sharing your experience, helping ensure nothing like this happens again. Thomas was surprised by the offer. I'm 70 years old, Mr. Secretary, and possess wisdom our young operators desperately need, the Secretary countered. Not full-time service, periodic consultations, speaking engagements, advisory capacity. Sure. Thomas promised to consider it, though his thoughts were already turning toward home, toward Riverdale, toward the quiet life he'd built there, now freed from shadows. After the meeting, he rejoined Emma among the precise rows of white headstones. Together they walked to the section where 8 freshly updated markers stood in silent formation. What did the Secretary want? Emma asked. Thomas explained the offer briefly. Not sure it's for me, he concluded. I've had enough of Washington, of military bureaucracy. Emma studied him thoughtfully. But not enough of helping others, of making a difference. It wasn't a question. Thomas glanced at her, recognizing the insight that sometimes made her seem far older than her 17 years. Perhaps not, he conceded. They stood in silence before the 8 headstones, each bearing a name Thomas knew by heart, each representing a life cut short by betrayal, but now finally honored in truth. They would want you to do it, Emma said quietly, to make sure their story helps others, prevents other betrayals. Thomas knew she was right. The men he'd served with, the brothers he'd fought beside, would want their deaths to mean something, to create change, to protect future warriors from similar treachery. Maybe a limited role, he allowed. Occasional consulting. Nothing that takes me away from Riverdale too much. From me, you mean? Emma teased gently. Thomas smiled. From home, he clarified, which includes you, the shop, the whole town. As they walked back toward the cemetery entrance, Thomas felt a sense of completion, of circles closing. The long journey that had begun in the dust of Fallujah 15 years ago was ending here among the honored dead, with truth restored and justice served. Not a perfect ending. The 8 men were still gone, their potential unrealized, their futures unlived. But an ending with honor, with acknowledgement, with peace. Ready to go home? Emma asked as they reached the gates. Thomas took one last look back at Arlington's seemingly endless rows of white markers, each representing service-sacrifice duty. Among them now his 8 brothers rested in properly acknowledged honor. Yes, he said simply. I'm ready. The drive back to Montana was long but peaceful, grandfather and granddaughter sharing the road in conversation with the ease of family who had weathered storms together and emerged stronger. They spoke of Emma's college plans. She'd been accepted to the University of Montana for the following fall. Close enough to come home weekends, but far enough for independence. They discussed the shop, busier now, with Thomas's increased profile requiring perhaps an apprentice to help manage the workload. And they talked about the future, both personal and shared. The possibilities that opened when life was no longer defined by secrets kept and truths hidden. As they crossed the Montana state line, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. The simple joy of returning home without looking over his shoulder, without scanning for threats, without wondering if today was the day the past would catch up. Riverdale welcomed them, as it always did, quietly, without fuss. Main Street looked the same. The mountains in the distance, unchanged by the drama that had unfolded beneath them. Outside Garrett's timepieces, the American flag flew in the spring breeze, not the burned flag from Fallujah, but a new one that symbolized not just country, but personal renewal, Honor restored, truth acknowledged. Thomas parked the truck and stepped out, taking a moment to appreciate the sight. Beside him, Emma did the same, understanding without words the significance of this homecoming. The shop door opened and Sarah Newman emerged, having kept an eye on the place during their absence. "Welcome back," she called, crossing the street to greet them. "How was Arlington?" "Proper," Thomas replied simply, "as it should have been 15 years ago." Sarah nodded, understanding. "Town's been quiet while you were gone. Almost boring." "Boring sounds perfect," Emma laughed, stretching after the long drive. Thomas moved toward the shop, feeling its familiar pull. Inside, 8 empty spaces awaited in the memorial watch display, the originals now with the families of the fallen. These spaces soon to be filled with new creations, public now, rather than private remembrances. As he unlocked the door, Thomas glanced up at the flag once more, thinking of all it had come to represent, not just patriotism or military service, but personal journey, truth revealed, honor redeemed. The silent flag that had kept its secrets for 15 years now flew freely in the Montana breeze, its message clear for all to see. Some things are worth fighting for, worth standing for, worth breaking silence for. Some truths cannot remain buried forever. Thomas Garrett, watchmaker and warrior grandfather and guardian, entered his shop with steady steps. The shadows were gone, the past acknowledged, the future open.